On May 1st, 1851, May Day, Queen Victoria of Great Britain presided over the opening of the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations. She was accompanied by her husband, Prince Albert, who had been involved in the creation of the exhibition, and 25,000 people, season ticket holders only on that first day, streamed through the doors of what was called the Crystal Palace, a magnificent steel and glass exhibition space in Hyde Park, in the very center of London. The Great Exhibition, which has gone down in history as the first true World's Fair, showcased over 100,000 objects from various countries, but the spotlight was on Britain and the products of British industry. Some of the most popular exhibits at the fair involved engines and machinery used in industrial manufacturing. There were steam lines run under Hyde Park to power these machines. Whether fairly or not, historians have often pointed to the Great Exhibition of 1851 as a watershed in modern British history, exemplifying the spirit of the Victorian age, and especially its attitude toward industry and technology. The Industrial Revolution was about 100 years old in 1851, but would quickly reach new heights and depths in the following decades. On November 30th, 2022, a new product called ChatGPT was released to the public by a company, ostensibly not-for-profit, called OpenAI. For the first time on any significant scale, ordinary people could interact with a computer network termed artificial intelligence and converse with it in normal everyday language. ChatGPT was wildly popular. People all over the world were experimenting with it, so many that OpenAI technicians were afraid that the computers that powered it, GPUs or graphics processing units, would literally melt. Within 5 days, ChatGPT had 1 million users. It had 100 million within 2 months of its launch. Google and other Silicon Valley companies reacted quickly, suddenly chucking many of their development strategies and deciding quickly to go all in on AI. These two events, the opening of the Great Exhibition and the unveiling of ChatGPT, occurred 171 years apart. Aside from the normal sequence of history or wild butterfly effect type speculation, is there a connection between them? Well, yes, there is. This video wouldn't exist if I didn't think so. The connective tissue between the Crystal Palace exhibition and our modern artificial intelligence boom consists of a lot of historical events. The Great Disaster you've probably heard of, the horror of the trenches of World War I, the atomic age, the space race, Vietnam, the dot-com boom and bust, and a lot more. You see, in the Western world, and even in many other parts of the world you wouldn't immediately classify as the West, there has been, over the last 200 years or so, a unique and pervasive optimism in the power of technology to transform society for the better. To a certain extent, the transformative power of technology is self-evident. Tech is everywhere in our modern lives. It's in our pockets, our ears, our homes, our classrooms, everywhere. It's enabled us to walk on the moon, to treat cancers and other diseases that were automatic death sentences not so long ago, and to bring the world together in ways no one had dreamed possible 50 or even 30 or 20 years ago. But there are also undoubtedly dark sides of technology too, and there always have been. The purpose of this video is to provoke some thoughts about what can happen when our faith in technology's power to transform isn't always justified, or when that transformation isn't positive. That unique and pervasive optimism in the power of technology can easily cross the line into blind faith. Have we crossed that line too often in the past 150 to 200 years? I don't know if I can answer that question definitively, or if it could ever be answered by anyone. But the purpose of this video is to make you think about it. This is the cult of technology, from railroads to AI. Hi, my name is Sean Munger. I'm a historian, teacher, and author. I have a PhD in history, and my niche here on YouTube is doing context-heavy, deep dive videos on various historical topics. This video is slightly different than some of my recent ones. It's more of a video essay than a straight narrative history, though you will get some historical stories here that I think you'll find interesting. Now we're going to cover a lot of ground here at a very high bird's eye view level, jumping from topic to topic and moving quickly through the last 170 odd years. Let me lay my cards on the table right at the outset. My thesis in this essay is, the more unqualified society's faith in the positive transformative power of technology is, the harsher the historical correction tends to be. I believe the examples I've chosen to look at, starting with railroads and leapfrogging through various eras and technological developments up to the present, lend support to that thesis. At the end of the day, you may agree, you may not, but I hope at least that I will have given you some valuable food for thought. I am not anti-technology, a Luddite, as the term is often put. I don't think we should revert to the Stone Age or even the 18th century. I use a smartphone, just like most of you probably do every day. And obviously, I'm working and teaching on YouTube, a major product of the technological and information revolution that most of us have witnessed firsthand in the past 20, 30, 50 or so years. My attitude toward technology is probably best summed up by a line that appeared in the film Contact, made in 1997, based on the 1985 science fiction novel by astronomer Carl Sagan. I'm not against technology. I'm against the men who deify it at the expense of human truth. Maybe that's a little more flowery and absolutist than I would put it, and maybe Matthew McConaughey isn't the ideal spokesman for the idea. But generally, I think the sentiment is pretty much right on. Now, this video is not my first pass at this subject. I made a video 3 years ago in 2022 called The Meaning of the Titanic, where I talked about societal attitudes towards technology and its transformative power, specifically linking it to the Victorian and Edwardian ideas of progress with a capital P. In this video, I'm taking a much wider view of the same subject, but you will notice the Titanic is among the examples I'm marshaling to support my thesis. But this video is not going to be just a retread of that one. We're covering a lot of new ground here too. As you may know, there's a members section on my channel. There are occasionally some things I can't show you on the free version of the channel due to ad-friendly guidelines. Images that have to be redacted not by my choice. Anyway, those are restored in the version of this video in the members section. And the members section version is ad-free. So if you want to see it, think about becoming a member. In a moment, we'll get back to the subject of the Great Exhibition of 1851 and what it says about attitudes toward technology and what they mean to civilization as a whole. Then we'll start with my case studies. Some of this material may challenge attitudes you have toward the role of technology in history and society. Again, this is a video essay, an argument. I may not be right, and you may not agree with my conclusions, but my job as a teacher of history is to make you think about the past in a new way. I hope, in this video, to do that. In 1982, a somewhat obscure children's author named Jerome Beatty wrote a whimsical novel for kids called Bob Fulton's Terrific Time Machine. In it, a boy genius inventor creates a time machine that transports him to the future, where he lives on a space colony called Perfecta. The citizens of Perfecta are oppressed by an all-knowing machine called Superputer, who spies on everyone through pocket-sized computers that people are required by law and social custom to carry on their persons at all times. These pocketputers, as Beatty termed them, were ubiquitous and inescapable. Everyone had them, and they were always listening and spying on their users. The book was written long before smartphones were even technologically possible, but it's eerie just how spot on Beatty's vision was more than 40 years ago. Nowadays, just about everybody carries what the book called a pocketputer, and as most of us know, they really do spy on us all the time. Scammers, hackers, companies hungry to sell your data, government agencies, even your own internet service provider. Fortunately, there's a way around all that. You probably know what a VPN is, virtual private network. But there's one VPN service that stands out, and that's private internet access. This is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through basically an encrypted tunnel. It's especially good if you're connecting on a public Wi-Fi network, such as an airport, restaurant, or a friend's house. Especially nice, private internet access has a strict no logs policy. What that means is they don't record or store user data. That's not just an idle claim. That policy was verified in a court proceeding and also by third-party auditors. This is why I chose private internet access. Their policy is proven and verified. You can get private internet access for all platforms, Windows, Mac, Android, whatever, and you can use it on an unlimited number of devices at the same time. An added benefit, while using the VPN, you can access streaming services, websites, and content unavailable in various countries by giving you the option to change your IP address to any one of 91 countries. Example, believe it or not, the classic 1968 drama film The Lion in Winter about Henry II and his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, for whom Katharine Hepburn won an Oscar for playing, is not available on Netflix in any English-speaking country. With the VPN, though, you can change your apparent country of origin to, say, Lithuania, and watch it on Netflix, no problem. If you go to this link, piavpn.com/Sean Munger, you can get 83% off, which comes out to $2.03 a month, a huge savings, and you get 4 months free. Go to the link, or you can just scan the QR code on the screen there. As problematic as technology can sometimes be, that's the point of this video, we do have to live with it. Private internet access can help you use it safely and make sure that your pocket-pewter isn't ratting you out to someone you don't trust with your private information. My thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. Now let's return to the cult of technology and the Crystal Palace exhibition of London in the mid-19th century. The Great Exhibition of 1851 has a reputation for being a smash hit success from the word go. It may not have been. The records of attendance for the first month are only anecdotal, and not everyone in London or elsewhere in Britain was a big fan of it, as there was a surprising number of detractors. But within a month, the exhibition was drawing perhaps 14,000 visitors a day. It was the kind of event that you went to more than once. There were, after all, over 100,000 items in numerous galleries, so the exhibition was designed to foster repeat business. Queen Victoria attended many times, often with one or more of her kids, including her eldest son Bertie, the future King Edward VII. Distinguished foreign visitors included Prince Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia, the future Emperor of Germany, and father of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who wasn't born yet at the time of the exhibition. Progress, which you could spell with a capital P to get across what the Victorians thought of it, was a major theme of the fair. Technology and machinery were a major part of that. James Ward, a reviewer of the exhibition, proclaimed that the machines at the fair were, quote, the epitome of man's industrial progress, of his untiring efforts to release himself from his material bondage. End quote. This was pretty typical of middle-class Britain's attitudes toward technology. In addition to being efficient, profitable, and patriotic, many people, Queen Victoria among them, thought the machines displayed at the fair were aesthetically beautiful. One commentator for Scientific American wrote specifically of the locomotives on display, quote, "Oh, how I like to look upon those mighty iron arms heaving up and down, or moving backwards and forwards at every heave of the steam giant's breast." End quote. Sounds like that guy really needs a date. Anyway, the promotion of technology, particularly British technology, was a major objective of the Great Exhibition. The men who created and organized it, specifically the Royal Society for the Arts, originally founded in 1753 under a different name, came up with the idea, inspired by smaller-scale exhibitions, particularly in France, as a means, in part, to address two problems. First, they perceived that the British education system was failing to produce enough people who could competently staff and guide the industries that were becoming an increasingly large share of the nation's economy. Earlier in the 19th century, there had been an experimentation with design schools, hoping to train people, mostly men, for careers in industry, which had arisen only in recent decades to replace the old medieval and early modern economy based on artisans and apprenticeship. The design schools were not viewed, at least by the Royal Society, as a smashing success. Secondly, the manufacturers, business tycoons, and aristocrats, who mostly made up the Royal Society, were a little put out that, on the whole, they thought British consumers preferred cheaper and, in their view, less tastefully designed goods from France and the continent than the more aesthetically pleasing British-made goods that they manufactured. Case in point, a tea set designed and manufactured by Henry Cole, displayed at a smaller scale local exhibition in 1846, was thought to be exactly the kind of thing that British consumers should want to buy and use. The Great Exhibition was designed in part to teach British consumers the Royal Society's preferred conception of aesthetic taste. Henry Cole was one of the exhibition's major organizers. As we'll see throughout this story, aesthetics are a major part of what I term the cult of technology. The exhibition closed on October 11, 1851. By some estimates, a sixth of Great Britain's entire population had visited it at least once, and it went down in history as a huge success. The Crystal Palace building that housed it, itself touted as a technological and aesthetic marvel, was dismantled, removed from Hyde Park, and then reassembled on a different site in Sydenham, opening in 1854. Notably, 15 people were killed in an accident during the reconstruction of the palace. It remained there until well into the next century, housing future exhibitions, and the Crystal Palace became a landmark in London, visited by an average of 2 million people every year. It was a constant reminder of technology, manufacturing, and commercial dominance through the most critical years of the mid and late 19th century, when the British Empire grew to its largest extent and controlled a significant share of the world's resources. This point is important, I think. Historically, we associate the Victorian era, particularly its later stages, with the height of British power around the world. This was the time when red-coated, white-helmeted British soldiers patrolled forts from India to Australia and many other places, when cotton, grown under British control in Egypt, and tea, grown by British-owned plantations in India, were among the biggest cash crops in the world. Technology had a lot to do with this. A major reason why those red-coated British troops started to appear in places like Southeast Asia and the interior of Africa was because of technological marvels like the steamship and modern drugs like quinine that tamed malaria and allowed large-scale garrisons of European soldiers to survive in tropical climates long enough to build forts and administer colonies in these far-flung places. A major reason why this sort of imperialism happened at all was so raw materials from colonial societies could fuel manufacturing back home in the mother country. Witness again cotton from Egypt that made its way into British textile manufacturing, or rubber from Southeast Asia that made possible the widespread popularity of bicycles at the end of the 19th century. Bikes need tires, and eventually automobiles in the 20th century. Colonialism is, among other things, about the expropriation of resources from colonialized societies to those of the colonizers. Britain was very good at this. The exploitation of cheap labor was also a huge part of imperialism and always has been. Catholic farmers in Ireland, plantation workers in India, rubber harvesters in Malaya, and at home too, like Welsh coal miners whose toils under terrible conditions fed the coal scuttles of British warships and luxury ocean liners alike. And naturally, it wasn't just the British doing this kind of thing. French, Germans, Americans, Belgians, Dutch, even the Japanese were heavily in on the imperialism game by the end of the 19th century. Colonialism, one major element of the idea of capital P progress, developed ideologies to justify itself. You may have heard of the white man's burden, which was a famous poem by British writer Rudyard Kipling, a staunch defender of imperialism and colonialism. The poem, written in 1899, specifically referenced the conquest of the Philippines by the United States following the Spanish-American War. The poem's title made its way into this famously racist advertisement for soap, which used the image of Admiral George Dewey, winning commander of the 1898 Battle of Manila Bay, where the United States defeated the Spanish fleet. Even soap, a commodity mass-produced by industrial processes, was being marketed under the guise of capital P progress, as if by using Pear's soap, the poor non-white peoples of colonialized societies like the Philippines could become more like white people. An extremely ugly idea, but this kind of thing was mainstream at the end of the 19th century. While it was arguably on its way up in the mid to late 19th century, the cult of technology wasn't fully formed yet. But already, technology and industrialization had demonstrated plenty of dark sides. Much of the writing of Charles Dickens focused on the costs of industrialization in mid-Victorian Britain. His social conscience novels like Hard Times or Nicholas Nickleby depicted urban, labor, and social problems wrought by the rapid industrialization of Britain's economy in the early Industrial Revolution. In the 1860s, the United States fought a grotesque and sanguinary civil war over the issue of slavery. This conflict had a number of technological dimensions. The issue of slavery itself was indirectly about technology. The South didn't have much of it, and their agrarian economy was powered by forced human labor, while the North was becoming heavily industrialized, with their factories and industries powered mostly by wage labor. The Civil War settled which system would become predominant in the United States. The war itself was so bloody and catastrophic in part because of technology. Both armies tended to use rifles, a relatively new technology, but the tactics of their commanders were stuck back in the era of musketry, where frontal charges with hundreds of troops were the go-to technique. And that's not to mention the technological firsts of the war itself, like the famous naval duel of the ironclad ships Monitor and Merrimac, which demonstrated to astute observers around the world what the future of industrial warfare might look like. While not technology in the sense of machines, an important dimension of the U.S. Civil War was what you could call financial technology. The North had banks and complex financial instruments, bonds and loans and concentrations of capital shifting back and forth between the federal government, which became much more financially sophisticated during the war, and private industry that manufactured the weapons and provided the industry needed to win it. As we'll see in the next two chapters, financial technology was a prerequisite of the large-scale development of railroads in the United States. Yet in one sense, you could interpret the American Civil War as the validation and triumph of capital P progress, as the Victorians tended to understand it. The more technologically advanced side had prevailed, abolishing the backwards feudalism of slavery, making America safe for wage labor, industrialization, and big business. The United States could now fully join the family of advanced nations that were deploying technology progress to remake the world in its image. It's no coincidence that within a decade or so after the end of the Civil War, the United States mounted its own version of Britain's Crystal Palace exhibition, the Centennial Exposition of 1876, which took place in Philadelphia and was opened by U.S. President Ulysses Grant, the former Union commander in the Civil War. Just like the Great Exposition, the Centennial event featured engines, machines, and technological devices as major attractions. In fact, the largest steam engine in the world at that time, the Corliss steam engine, supplied power to the entire fair. Technological innovation was the backbone of the idea of capital P progress, as Victorian-era people understood it. The expositions of the era are an easy way to understand that concept, which is why I started with them. But to see the concept in practice on the ground, let's shift our attention to the biggest technological boom of the 19th century, railroads. That's in the next chapter. In 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition in Britain, there were a little more than 9,000 miles of railroad tracks in use in the United States. Railroads were profitable, but at that time they were mostly local enterprises, with a few lines and networks that could be called regional. Almost nothing was standardized. There were over 20 different types of railroad gauges in use. A gauge in railroad terms means the distance between the two rails. 10 years later, at the outbreak of the Civil War, there were 31,286 miles of railroad track in the U.S., but there were almost none of the prerequisites that would be needed to build a transcontinental railroad, a dream that had been floating around since the technology of trains had become feasible as a means of mass transportation. First in Britain in the 1820s, and then in America in the succeeding decade. The Civil War changed that. Indeed, the opening of the conflict in 1861 handed Abraham Lincoln and the fairly new Republican Party an unprecedented opportunity to reshape the whole United States on a very broad level without facing the kind of heated opposition that such plans would have engendered before the war. The reason for that is simple. By the mid-1850s, the pro- and anti-slavery wings of the two major political parties had realigned as the Republican Party, with its strength in the North and the cities, and the Democratic Party, with its strength in the South and rural areas. I talked a bit about this in my video on Franklin Pierce. In 1861, when the southern states attempted to secede in order to protect the institution of slavery, the South withdrew almost all its representatives and senators from Congress. Most of them were Democrats. With a supermajority and the popular mandate of preserving the Union while winning the war, Lincoln and the Republicans could ram through Congress almost any program they could get other Republicans to agree on. That was how, for instance, we got the Homestead Act of 1862. And it's also how the federal government got into the business of railroads, such as with the Pacific Railway Act of the same year, 1862, whose purpose was to use railroads to keep California in the far west bound to the Union. This, as well as several other bills passed on the federal level during the war, was ultimately the genesis of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was carefully designed to benefit the North, not the South. It was Lincoln who decided that the Pacific Railway, the seed of the Transcontinental, would use what came to be called standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches. After 1863, all the major railroads fell into line to use that gauge, even those eventually built in Canada and Mexico. Notably, the U.S. federal government did not use its own funds to build railroads directly. Instead, it used private money and privately owned enterprises, like regional railroads, for public benefit. An example would be when Secretary of War Edwin Stanton negotiated in 1862 a deal whereby the federal government could use private railroads for military transportation at a 10% discount from their usual rates. The federal government was getting into bed, financially and politically speaking, with the railroads. Remember what I said in the last chapter about financial technology? Well, that's exactly how the railroads got financed. New kinds of bonds and treasury bills were flowing out of Washington to be purchased by individual investors to finance the war. The consortiums of businessmen who decided early to get in on the Transcontinental Railroad, like the group of investors assembled by California merchant Collis Huntington, did exactly the same thing. In fact, people like Jay Cooke, Leland Stanford, and Charles Crocker, heavily lobbied the government to jumpstart the Transcontinental Railroad in the first place, precisely so that they could get rich by using that kind of financial technology to raise the capital to build it. They did. Not for nothing is the most prestigious university in California named after Leland Stanford. As the project to build the Transcontinental ramped up, the federal government gave something a lot more valuable than cash. They donated huge tracts of land. The government gave the railroads alternating parcels along the tracks in sort of a checkerboard pattern. But the building of a railroad through what would otherwise be mostly inaccessible wilderness enabled the government to raise the price on the remaining parcels of land it could sell to private landowners and homesteaders. So everybody got rich. Railroad companies got free land, essentially a government subsidy, and the government could sell its most valuable commodity and populate the West at the same time. Win-win, right? Who could stand to lose from this arrangement? Oh, well, yeah, Most of the land through which the railroads would pass was owned by Native Americans. The federal government was merely a middleman, basically facilitating the transfer of ownership of much of the American West from them, the natives who had lived on it for centuries, to the railroad companies. This was definitely a program of expropriation, one of the hallmarks of colonialism, which I noted in the last chapter. I'm not going to go through the story of the building and engineering of the Transcontinental Railroad. That's been well documented elsewhere. In May 1869, there was the famous ceremony at Promontory Summit, Utah, where a golden spike was driven by Leland Stanford, no less, to connect the Central Pacific and Union Pacific railroads. This was mostly a PR move. The Transcontinental Railroad wasn't even technically finished yet, as some lines in California and Missouri remained to be completed. Suffice it to say, the project, which admittedly was an immense engineering and technological accomplishment like nothing else in history until arguably the Apollo moon landing a century later, was completed with a great deal of public money and a lot of cheap labor, much of it, at least in California, from Chinese immigrants who were ruthlessly exploited and in many cases killed. You should already be seeing a pattern that major technological advances often come at steep costs in labor and environmental exploitation. This was definitely true of the railroad. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad triggered a railroad boom and an economic bubble, something else we're going to see repeated again and again in this story. In 1865, there were 35,085 miles of railroads in the United States. By 1873, there were 70,784, with the largest share of these built between 1870 and 1872. This was despite the fact that the Transcontinental Railroad was unprofitable and service was notoriously spotty. It's not like hordes of people were queued up in Omaha, waiting to go west as soon as it was finished. The railroads had huge problems with excess capacity. Why were railroads so overbuilt? Well, graft was a major reason. In 1864, bigwigs in the Union Pacific Railroad, among them Thomas Clark Durant, formed a company called Credit Mobilier, which would finance the gargantuan project of building the Transcontinental Railroad. Many of the investors in Credit Mobilier were congressmen and other politicians or public officials. In reality, Credit Mobilier was basically a huge scam. The crux of the scam was a very old form of graft, the overfunded contract. Simply put, expensive as it was, the actual cost of building the Transcontinental Railroad was less than the vast sums Credit Mobilier raised. The fat cats pocketed the difference. In 1872, while President Ulysses Grant was running for re-election, the New York Sun newspaper began exposing the fraud. The Credit Mobilier scandal tainted the Grant administration and various other politicians, including a congressman from Ohio, James Garfield. As usual, the politicians claimed they didn't know about any wrongdoing, or didn't do anything wrong, or both. This scandal has made an appearance in my videos before. It features in both my video on the presidential election of 1872 and also the biography of James Garfield, a subject that's hot right now because of the Netflix series Death by Lightning. Now, I'm not going to take credit for inspiring that project, obviously, but I will note that in that video I did call for a big-budget Hollywood film to be made of Garfield's life. The Netflix producers did not heed my suggestion to cast Andrew Garfield in the role, but alas, one can't have everything. The Credit Mobilier scandal did not take down the careers of either Grant or Garfield, but it does show what a corrupt boondoggle the building of the railroad really was. It was also a harbinger of worse things to come. By 1872, the ability to raise large amounts of money for railroad construction was drying up. The financiers who had used the railroads as an excuse for lining their pockets began to realize the jig was almost up. This coming at the same time as a financial slump in Europe, triggered indirectly by the unification of Germany, led to a major depression in the United States. It began with the failure of the bank J. Cook & Company. I mentioned Cook earlier as one of the geniuses who used financial technology to enrich his own company. Cook had been hoping to build a second, transcontinental railroad. But the lack of ability to raise funds for it in the US and the financial panic in Europe meant that he couldn't sell the bonds he needed to raise the money either in the United States or in Europe. The many banks and investors who his firm had borrowed money from called in their chips. Cook had bupkis to pay them back with. On September 18, 1873, his firm declared bankruptcy. The failure of Cook's house started a tsunami that rippled through the entire economy. The New York Stock Exchange closed trading. Businesses started failing. Banks went bust. Between September 1873 and the beginning of 1874, no less than 25 railroads defaulted on a collective debt of over $150 million. That's $150 million $1874, about $4.2 billion in today's money. It got worse. 71 railroads defaulted in 1874 and 25 in 1875. Millions of people lost their jobs. It wasn't just limited to the United States. The economies of Canada and Mexico, who were also participating in the railroad boom, were ruined too. The Panic of 1873, as it was called, was the worst economic depression in U.S. history up until that time. The disaster illustrates a common theme in the history of the cults of technology. A lot of people trying to cash in on public affinity and exuberance for the development of a relatively new technology, artificially inflating an economic bubble, only to be ruined in the end. But you could say, wasn't this simply the price of capital P progress? I mean, yes, banks went down and people went unemployed. There were riots in various American cities, political upheaval, etc., but didn't the nation ultimately benefit from all the railroad infrastructure that had been built out, perhaps prematurely? Incidentally, this same claim was made about fiber optic networks that were overbuilt during the dot-com bubble of the 1990s and early 2000s. Well, even at the time there was skepticism. Many of the railroad lines built in the early 1870s didn't go anywhere useful or were shoddily constructed or otherwise defective. Fraud, not working railroads, was the main product of the railroad boom. In 1878, a man called Charles Hassler, a railroad industry financial analyst, wrote in Railway Age magazine that because of the massive frauds perpetrated on the public during the boom and the lack of usefulness of what was actually built, the country was better off without all the track that had been built. We're not done with the subject of railroads. Indeed, the railroad barons regrouped from the Panic of 1873 and went right back to doing what they'd been doing before, and with ultimately a similar result. Another pattern that repeats itself in the history of the cult of technology is a stubborn unwillingness to learn from past mistakes. That story, or at least one of them, is in the next chapter. In 1877, while the Great Depression caused by the popping of the railroad economic bubble was still going on, there was a series of crippling strikes in the railroad industry in the United States. As is usual in these kinds of financial panics, the companies who owned the infrastructure tried to survive by cutting back the wages and benefits of those who actually did the work, the railroad laborers in this case. In 1877, the strikes by railroad workers against management turned violent, especially in Baltimore, where 10 people were killed, and Pittsburgh, where riots that resulted in the burning of a railroad depot and related conflicts left 61 people pushing up daisies. I'm not going to go into these conflicts in detail, except to note that in the vast majority of cases, the deaths were caused by troops on the side of management, firing on civilians. By 1879, the Depression was lessening, in part because huge numbers of immigrants, most from Central, Southern, or Eastern Europe, were now flooding into U.S. ports. This meant a new supply of cheap labor and low-paying jobs. There was essentially a second railroad boom in the 1880s. As the ability to raise money to finance railroads returned, the railroads, now increasingly complex corporations, rather than fronts for one or a small group of robber barons, returned to their old tricks of overbuilding. Indeed, railroads outdid each other in building useless tracks and lines. An example of this is what happened in Kansas. By 1889, there were 6 different railroad companies running 7 separate lines that linked western Kansas to the Nebraska border. Nobody needed these lines, and there wasn't the traffic to support them. They didn't bring people to western Kansas. In fact, the population of that area declined by nearly 50% between 1887 and 1897. By 1890, Kansas had more railroad track than New York or New England, areas with vastly greater population per capita. And it wasn't just Kansas, though the numbers there give us a particularly representative example. This was happening all over the West. Why? Well, in part it was because railroad graft was so deeply intertwined with politics that the two couldn't be separated. In the 1870s and 1880s, railroad lobbyists had bought so many politicians on Capitol Hill that much of Congress's job in this period was passing bills that gave subsidies, land, or other perks to railroad companies. Congressmen and senators couldn't get elected without help from the railroads. It wasn't just construction graft and sweetheart financing deals like with Credit Mobilier. Giving politicians and their families free railroad passes for life was a common perk. The railroad business was thoroughly rotten. Charles Francis Adams, president of the Union Pacific Railroad, he was also the grandson of U.S. President John Quincy Adams and great-grandson of John Adams. Anyway, in an 1888 letter, he wrote, quote, "The railroad situation, in my opinion, is as bad can be. I think we are all going to the devil and going together. The contempt I feel for the railroad men of this country as a whole, I make no effort to express, as language is wholly inadequate for the purpose. I should never have conceived it possible that a great system could have outgrown the men in charge of it, as our railroad system has during the last 20 years. It is wallowing in the mire." End quote. In 1893, a commentator in the Financier magazine wrote, quote, "They, the railroad stockholders, frequently awake at an 11th hour to a realization that the underpinning of their stock holdings is entirely rotten, that assets have no foundation in fact, and that the respective companies are, to all intents and purposes, positively bankrupt." End quote. Having already caused one major financial collapse, the corrupt and incompetent railroad barons charged full speed ahead into another one, the Northern Pacific Railway, which had already gone bankrupt once in 1875, grew ever more overextended in the early 1890s, and was hemorrhaging money by the summer of 1893. Silver mining in the West had dried up, and without silver to haul, the Northern Pacific's traffic fell off. Federal Treasury policy regarding silver also contributed to this, as did ruinous protectionist tariffs championed by future U.S. President William McKinley. In any event, the Northern Pacific went into receivership in October 1893. The Union Pacific and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe soon followed. There were runs on banks. As in 1873, there were concurrent financial panics in Europe. The downturn was even more severe than it had been 20 years earlier, with millions out of work. Indeed, many Americans referred to this event as the Great Depression, until an even worse financial collapse in the 1930s snatched away that name, which has stuck ever since. At the depths of the Depression, in 1894, a series of strikes involving the Pullman Company, which manufactured rail cars, crippled transportation across much of the United States. As in the 1870s, some demonstrations turned violent, and U.S. President Grover Cleveland even sent in federal troops at one point to crush the strike. The railroads carried the mail, and with railroads crippled, the mail couldn't move. Cleveland famously declared, quote, "If it takes the entire Army and Navy of the United States to deliver a postcard in Chicago, that card will be delivered." End quote. The Depression had political fallout. A populist movement had already been rising in America before the Panic of 1893. Populist sentiments profoundly affected American politics. The counter-reaction to that, by political interests seeking to stabilize and perpetuate the corporate order, came with the presidential election of 1896, in which William McKinley, the same champion of those draconian tariffs that had caused so much trouble 6 years before, went to the White House after defeating William Jennings Bryan, who co-opted some populist themes in his campaign. Anarchism also became strongly attractive to many Americans in this period. To be sure, this was the leftist strain of anarchism, associated with figures like Emma Goldman, rather than the much more right-wing form of anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, that would play a role in the cult of technology a century later. William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist in 1901, something of an ironic, if still tragic, end for him. In the end, the close relationship between the railroads and politics, particularly on the federal level, assured that political power would always backstop and cover for the excesses and missteps of the railroads. Railroads in America never operated on what you might call free market principles, not in the 1860s and 70s, and not in the 1890s or in the 20th century. The countless bailouts, subsidies, and outright gifts of land and money to railroad companies assured that they would never really be in existential danger. In modern parlance, the railroads were too big to fail, even though they absolutely would have failed if they had been forced to operate in the free market without the sort of corporate welfare that was very common in the period of the 19th century railroad boom. Was it worth it? More than 100 years later, it's easy to argue that the development of the railroad network was a net positive in American history, as it greatly facilitated the settlement and development of the far West. But there were staggering costs associated with that development. Take, for instance, the buffalo, which were nearly wiped out on the Great Plains in the final decades of the 19th century. The railroads greatly facilitated the destruction of the buffalo because they not only brought hunters to where the buffalo were, but they enabled the transport of buffalo hides to markets in the East. Because various Native American nations utterly depended on the buffalo for their livelihoods and survival, the coming of the railroad proved catastrophic for them. Railroads greatly aided the genocide against Native Americans. The railroads also helped establish a new non-human population in the West, cattle. Again, it was mostly about the ability to transport commodities to market, which caused a huge boom in the number of cattle being grazed in the West. This greatly changed environmental land use patterns and triggered intense competition for land and water resources. Range wars, like the famous Johnson County War in Montana in 1892, were the result, as well as the aggregation of most of the best lands in the West by corporations and a handful of wealthy individuals. Cattle companies of the West in the late 19th century were little more than Ponzi schemes, leaving financial as well as environmental destruction in their wake. Very few of these costs are ever taken into consideration when judging whether the railroads and the way they were built was, on balance, a positive thing. To be sure, it was never a choice between should America have railroads or should it not. The technology existed. It was useful. But I think the historical case is pretty clear. The railroads could have been built better, smarter, and much more equitably than they were. Part of the problem with how the railroads were built and managed was that society was infatuated with the technology and its implications. Building a railroad somewhere, anywhere, even if it went nowhere useful and carried little traffic, was always better than not building one. The enormous amounts of graft, corruption, and opportunity for financial gain inherent in the railroad systems were a symptom of how American society as a whole greatly incentivized the construction of the railroads. If people could get rich off of it, it was automatically worth doing, if only for that reason alone. We're going to see that factor repeat itself over and over again in this story. Let's turn now from transportation on land to transportation by sea. There's a particularly stark example of the cult of technology and how it could play out. You probably already know what I'm talking about. It's in the next chapter. The story of the Titanic resonates in popular culture in a way that almost no other historical event ever has. The public's appetite for anything connected with the famous 1912 disaster is pretty much insatiable. Aside from the numerous books, movies, stage musicals, and documentaries about the Titanic, there are even some entire YouTube channels devoted to it. People will shell out vast amounts of money for physical objects related to it. Our culture has a bizarre obsession with this event. Oh, you like my sweater? I don't usually wear sweaters, particularly ugly Christmas sweaters, but this video is coming out right before Christmas time. I got it at the Imperial War Museum in London, by the way, and yeah, these are Spitfires. Anyway, as I said at the beginning of this video, my first pass at covering what I call the cult of technology was in my 2022 video, The Meaning of the Titanic. I don't intend to rehash all of that here in this video. Go watch that one if you haven't already seen it, or go watch cat videos instead. I have no control over what you watch. In any event, one of my main points in that video was that a major reason why the Titanic disaster resonates with us is because of its element of hubris, the irony of a ship, called by some practically unsinkable, going down on its maiden voyage. Since I put out that video in 2022, the point I was making in it was validated tragically by subsequent events. I'm talking about the disaster involving the submersible Titan, where 5 people who were going down to get a glimpse of the wreck of the Titanic died when their submarine malfunctioned and imploded. That was in June 2023. I'm going to talk about that event briefly at the end of this chapter. But first, the basics. The Titanic was part of what you might liken to an arms race between private companies, passenger steamship lines of the early 20th century, and between nations, specifically Great Britain, Germany, and to a lesser extent, France. The technology of steam power made transatlantic travel much faster and less arduous in the early 19th century. Cunard, the most famous passenger line, started in 1840, specifically with a contract granted by the British government to haul transatlantic mail. By the second decade of the 20th century, ocean liners had become much bigger, faster, and more luxurious. Cunard's main competitor, the White Star Line, sought to respond to the introduction of the superfast, very luxurious liners Lusitania and Mauretania by building a trio of lavish passenger ships of their own, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. White Star felt that they couldn't compete with Cunard on speed, so they intended these ships to corner the market on luxury and prestige. This despite the fact that the real money in the transatlantic passenger business was in catering not to rich people, but to poor people, specifically the waves of immigrants that were still flowing from Europe to America, and a substantial traffic in the same people going the opposite way, usually to visit family they had left back home in the old country. Olympic came first, making her maiden voyage in 1911. Titanic, the second sister, was then under construction. The builders of the ships, Harland and Wolff shipyards of Belfast, Northern Ireland, did not make the claim that the ships were unsinkable. The words practically unsinkable, that modifier practically does a lot of heavy lifting there. Anyway, that appeared in Shipbuilder magazine in 1911 and specifically described Olympic. The White Star Line repeated the claim in their marketing materials. As I pointed out in my 2022 video, the claim was even repeated by the Titanic's captain, Edward Smith, who told a reporter, quote, "I cannot imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that," end quote. It was ridiculous, perhaps irresponsible, for Smith to have made this statement. As a seasoned merchant marine commander, he knew full well that there are many things that could cause a ship to sink. But playing up the technological perfection of Olympic and Titanic was good business for the White Star Line. So he and the corporate powers that be, specifically J. Bruce Ismay, president of White Star, were happy to use the practically unsinkable idea as a marketing tool. On the 5th night of its maiden voyage, Sunday, April 14th, 1912, Titanic struck a glancing blow against an iceberg that caused catastrophic damage below the waterline. Recent analysis has suggested that the steel in Titanic's hull may have been unusually weak at low temperatures. Nevertheless, though the ship was designed to float with 4 of its forward watertight compartments flooded, the damage sustained by the iceberg strike included a 5th compartment, a situation that its ship's designer Thomas Andrews had not anticipated. There are numerous ridiculous conspiracy theories regarding the Titanic. Unfortunately, the toxic poison of conspiracy theory has corrupted this historical event too. The tinfoil hat nonsense spun about the Titanic is even more ludicrous than most conspiracy theories. The idea that the ship that sank was actually the Olympic for some unfathomable reason, or the idea that financier J.P. Morgan, who owned the conglomerate that itself owned the White Star Line, sank it on purpose for, I don't know, something the Federal Reserve, something the Jews. Most conspiracy theories like these are anti-Semitic. It's all complete garbage, of course. What happened to the Titanic has been exhaustively documented for over a century now. Although the ship had lifeboat space for only about half of its complement of passengers and crew, it was within maritime regulations at the time. In one of the other many ironies in the story, the loss of life probably would have been much less if a nearby ship, the Californian, hadn't shut down her wireless set for the night just before Titanic began transmitting her famous distress call. That is not a failure of technology itself, but a failure to use technology properly. The disaster that sank the Titanic has generally gone down in popular memory as sort of a freak accident. After all, how could Andrews and the other designers have anticipated an iceberg strike of exactly that magnitude? Actually, it wasn't a freak accident. Iceberg collisions had caused ship disasters before, with significant loss of life, though none, of course, as lethal as the Titanic. The William Brown struck an iceberg and sank in April 1841, killing 47 people. The Pacific, apparently sunk by icebergs in 1856, killed all 186 people aboard. The SS Islander sank off the Alaskan coast in 1901, killing 40 and making worldwide headlines. So this kind of accident was by no means unprecedented. But the ship's positioning in the public consciousness, mainly through commercial marketing, as a particular exemplar of superior ocean-going technology, sturdy, safe, and reliable, as well as luxurious and decadent. All of that made for an irresistible story with a touch of hubris and the hint of being a cautionary tale. This is why Titanic is so ubiquitous in our popular culture. In 2009, a man called Stockton Rush, a former flight test engineer for McDonnell Douglas, as well as a venture capitalist, formed the company OceanGate with the view toward making money from deep-sea tourism. Rush built a deep-diving submersible called Titan. One of the express missions of this tiny vessel was to take paying customers 12,500 feet down to the bottom of the ocean to gawk at the decaying wreck of Titanic, which had been discovered by oceanographer Robert Ballard in 1985. Building deep-dive submarines is a complex business. The deep ocean is one of the most hostile environments imaginable, and the few people who have ever managed to do it have done so only as a result of supreme technical efforts and a focus on safety. Rush, however, had little time for this. He refused to have the Titan examined or certified by the few authorities that know how to develop deep-sea diving vehicles safely. As he famously told a podcast host in 2022, Rush said, quote, "I mean, if you just want to be safe, don't get out of bed, don't get in your car, don't do anything. At some point, you're going to take some risk, and it really is a risk-reward question. I think I can do this just as safely by breaking the rules," end quote. Spoiler alert, he couldn't. On a commercial dive to the wreck of Titanic in June 2023, the Titan, which was not built to the specs necessary to conduct deep ocean diving safely, imploded and killed all 5 people aboard, including Rush himself. This disaster occurred after I made my Meaning of the Titanic video, which is why it's not mentioned there. James Cameron, the film director best known for making the 1997 film Titanic, and who himself dove to the actual wreck more than 30 times, said this after the Titan tragedy, quote, I'm struck by the similarity of the Titanic disaster itself, where the captain was repeatedly warned about ice ahead of his ship, and yet he steamed at full speed into an ice field on a moonless night, and many people died as a result. For a very similar tragedy where warnings went unheeded to take place at the same exact site with all the diving that's going on around the world, I think is just astonishing. It's really quite surreal, end quote. It's not that surreal at all if you understand the cult of technology. Both Edward Smith, who died in the Titanic disaster in 1912, and Stockton Rush, who imploded with the Titan in 2023, both of them had put undue faith in the technology they controlled, or their own ability to control it, or both. Smith was nonchalant about the ice warnings that piled up on Titanic's bridge on that last day, April 14th. Rush sneered at the minimum safety protocols for deep-sea diving, one of the most dangerous activities one could possibly do. Both captains could be thought of as high priests of the cult of technology, and both pay the ultimate price. One of the main points of my video from 2022 was to frame the Titanic disaster as a foreshadowing, or quiver as I call it, of the much greater catastrophe that came 2 years later in 1914, the First World War. The war is highly relevant to our story about the cult of technology, and it's where we're going next. The First World War was many things, most of them bad. One of the things it was, and which is easy to overlook, is that it was a profound psychological and cultural shock to the Western world, and the rest of the world too. World War I shattered many people's assumptions about the primacy and stability of Western civilization. It was a counter-narrative to the Victorian and Edwardian idea of capital P progress. After all, if the world could descend into such incredible savagery, so much of it wrought by technology that was supposed to advance and enlighten civilization, then couldn't it be argued that the very underpinnings of Western civilization, morality, law, tradition, culture, and such, were seriously flawed? This is an idea that was advanced especially by artists in the years after the war. The art and literary movement called Dada, for example, sought to make people think about these sorts of issues. It was undeniable only a few months into the war that broke out in August 1914 that this conflict was particularly horrendous. Battles of the First World War were extraordinarily bloody, for much the same reason that battles in the American Civil War 50 years earlier had been. The technological capabilities of the weapons had advanced far beyond the tactics of the armies and commanders that used them. It's a cliché that generals are always fighting the last war, but in the case of World War I, it was pretty much true. General Joseph Joffre, the commander of French forces at the beginning of World War I, had served as a junior artillery officer in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Most of the military commanders of early World War I had been trained in tactics that dated from the 19th century, where horse-drawn cavalry and elaborate set-piece maneuvers by infantry troops were supposed to win wars. In fact, those kinds of tactics had been prevalent in the Napoleonic conflicts of the earlier 19th century. But as literally millions of German, French, British, Austro-Hungarian, Italian, and Russian soldiers found out to their detriment, waves of infantry troops charging trenches defended by machine guns was not the way to win this war. Machine guns were probably responsible for the lion's share of the 3.5 million military dead on the Western Front between 1914 and 1918, but they certainly weren't the only technological innovation that made the war so much more deadly than previous European wars had been. Poison gas was another infamous innovation. Many societies and countries had experimented with chemical warfare since ancient times, but the Industrial Revolution enabled it to be developed on a large scale for the first time. The French army used tear gas early in the war. The Germans experimented with various chemical agents, first on the Eastern Front against Russia, and then famously they deployed chlorine gas on the Western Front near Ypres, Belgium, which the British called wipers, in April 1915. After that, gas attacks became a hallmark of combat on the Western Front. Troops eventually carried gas masks as standard equipment. They didn't always help. Tens of thousands of troops were injured, blinded, or killed by gas attacks in World War I. The Germans used these weapons most frequently, but the British and French also tinkered around with them, usually with disastrous results. The obvious problem with flooding trenches with chlorine or mustard gas is that it would frequently affect the troops of the side using it. Aircraft was another front of ghastly technological advances during World War I. Rickety biplanes, usually made of fabric, were first used as observation and reconnaissance craft at the beginning of the war. But by its end, most of the major participants had developed combat air forces. World War I was the first war to feature significant dogfights between fighter aircraft. Heavy bombers weren't yet a thing, but the Germans famously bombed London from rigid airships, a brief taste of the horrors to come from the air in the Second War. Like most of the innovations of the war, submarines existed in some form before it, but the deadly and efficient use of them was perfected during World War I. The British in 1914 thought submarines' best use were as a coastal defense weapon. The Germans were forced to improvise by the British blockade of their coast, and they ultimately deployed subs as an offensive weapon, raiding surface ships, and eventually as part of a major military campaign to starve Britain of food, money, and supplies needed to continue the war. The event that truly brought home the lethality of the submarine was the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, which killed over 1,100 people. It wasn't that the British thought it was impossible that Lusitania, the last sizable passenger ship still in civilian service, could be caught by a German U-boat, although the Admiralty felt it was unlikely because of Lusitania's great speed. Part of the calculus was a gamble, that Germans wouldn't sink such a large target and potentially kill so many civilians. There was a moral element to this gamble. I mean, they wouldn't really do that, would they? Protocol early in the war was for U-boats to signal their prey, force them to offload their passengers and crew on boats, and then torpedo the ships. The Germans by May 1915 had demonstrated that they could and would break this protocol and simply sink ships without warning. But again, the Lusitania seemed to be in a special class. They wouldn't really go there, would they? You can see why the Germans felt they had no choice. Submarines in 1915 were slow, surprisingly dinky, and fragile. Their only real advantage was surprise, the ability to sneak up on an enemy and blow them away before they knew what was happening. Walter Schweiger was the German sub-commander who decided to call the British bluff. He did not survive the war. He died when his U-boat hit a mine in 1917. Thus, we have no direct statement from him about what he thought about the morality of aiming a torpedo at a civilian passenger liner loaded with nearly 2,000 people, many of them women and children. But if he had given testimony about that, I think he would have felt totally fine with it and claimed the Lusitania was a legitimate target. Now, this has nothing to do with conspiracy theories about whether the ship was carrying munitions illegally to Britain. It probably was. Technology, particularly weapons technology, has a way of inducing the people who use it to rationalize the human cost of using it to achieve what they see as a higher goal. Ask Harry Truman about that. Don't worry, we'll get to him in Chapter 8. When I visited the Imperial War Museum in London a few weeks before the making of this video, I took this picture of a life preserver from the Lusitania and the camisole worn by a woman who survived the sinking. Setting aside the issue of how you would feel if you survived a horrendous wartime disaster only to have the underwear you were wearing at the time preserved in a glass case 110 years later, it's clear the Lusitania was a grim turning point in the moral history of warfare. War has always been brutal and ugly, and civilians have always been targeted. But something seems different about this event, like what few moral red lines that might still have existed were now crossed. Only 24 years after Germans decided to annihilate the Lusitania, other Germans started exterminating their own people. Jews, yes, but also the institutionalized, developmentally disabled, and neurodivergent people among them, in the monstrous T4 program that historians mark as one of the milestones of the Holocaust. When World War I was over, people had various responses to it. Between 1918 and 1939, people called it the Great War, not knowing, of course, that a second and even more terrible conflict would break out within a generation. Speaking of generations, an entire one of young men and a lot of others had been utterly wiped out. Many families in all countries who participated shared the experience of profound loss. For families of soldiers who died in the trenches, many of them had no remains of their sons, husbands, or relatives to grieve over. Countless men had been literally blown to bits by machine gun bullets, artillery shells, bombs, or been sunk at sea, or in many horrible cases, sank and suffocated in the mud on the Western Front. The anonymity of death was what gave rise to monuments like the cenotaph in Britain and the tomb of the unknown soldier in the United States. This, too, was partially a feature of technology. The tech of modern warfare killed people so fast and in such great numbers that in the pile of corpses it produced, an individual soldier's identity would often be lost. Some battles of the war, like Verdun in 1916, were specifically fought to produce vast piles of corpses, to bleed the enemy dry through attrition rather than to overwhelm them by force. The weapons of World War I were uniquely appropriate for that purpose. Another response to the Great War was spiritualism. This movement, which sought to establish contact with the dead, had developed in the 19th century, but it truly had a heyday in the years following World War I. Countless people, in Britain particularly, but also other countries, tried to make contact with their dead loved ones through seances and other rituals. The spiritualist movement led to a boom time for various cranks and charlatans. For example, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the British author who created Sherlock Holmes, lost a son in the Great War. He was famously hoodwinked by this obviously doctored photograph, supposedly of fairies. He insisted the picture and the phenomenon were entirely genuine. Would occultists like Aleister Crowley, who reached the peak of his career in the 1920s, have gotten such cultural traction if they weren't operating in the wake of such a great event of tragedy and mortality? Indeed, even setting aside the issue of the war, the occult and spiritualist milieu can be viewed as sort of a reaction to the technological society, the capital P progress that was on its way up well before the Great War. Occultism and spiritualism sought to substitute the transformative power of magic, usually believed to be primal and ancient, for the transformative power of technology, which comes from science, rationalism, and the material world. Fascism has to be considered as another reaction to the Great War. Within 4 years of its end, in 1922, Italy became fascist under Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler took power in Germany 11 years later. Politically, the rise of fascism has a lot to do with the perceived political and economic failures of parliamentary democracies in Europe after World War I. But there's a technological component to fascism too. Fascism, particularly as developed in Italy by Mussolini, was a movement of mass action, mass participation, mass opinion. Mussolini was a former newspaper editor, and his papers, mass-produced on technologically advanced printing presses, reached all corners of Italy. Hitler's Germany harnessed the power of mass communications, radio, and especially motion pictures. Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, was especially interested in movies, which technology had taught to talk in the interwar years. Even the aesthetics of fascism seem to evoke the power of technology. San Siro, a major sports complex built in 1926, is full of concrete pillars and machine-milled shapes. So too is the EUR district, the Rome Universal Exposition, Echoes of Crystal Palace. This was built in the 1930s to celebrate Mussolini's New Order. Fusing classical motifs with modernism is basically the definition of fascist architecture. As much as fascism stoked longing for an imagined and idealized past, it also tended to embrace technology, not just as a means to attain and perpetuate power, but as an aesthetic and a cultural value. Mussolini and Hitler can be considered high priests of the cult of technology. So too can another authoritarian state that arose out of World War I, that being the Soviet Union. Let's take a brief detour there in the next chapter. In March 1917, at the height of World War I, the Romanov dynasty was overthrown by a popular revolution. A few months later, the provisional government that resulted from that revolution was itself overthrown by the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Ulyanov, also known as Lenin. This was one of the most consequential events of the 20th century. The Bolshevik state, which coalesced a few years later into the Soviet Union, held power for 74 years and was directly responsible for tens of millions of deaths, one of the most repressive regimes of the bloody and brutal 20th century. Lenin and the Bolsheviks loved technology and had arguably even more blind faith in its positive transformative power than people in Western countries. In 1919, as the Bolsheviks fought the Russian Civil War to consolidate their power, one of the leaders of the party, Nikolai Bukharin, who was later purged and executed by Stalin, wrote with others an influential book called The ABC of Communism, a primer for the people on the ideology and program of the new state. This book explicitly predicted that in the bold communist future planned by the Bolshevik Party, the entire economy of the Soviet Union would be planned and controlled by machines. This was a commonly held view among the Soviet leaders, including Lenin and Trotsky, who believed technology was a virtual panacea that would bring creaky agrarian Russia out of its economic and social backwardness, as they saw it, and transform it into a bold new world power. Lenin particularly believed in the power of electricity. One of his main goals after attaining state power was to build as many electric plants across the Soviet Union as possible, mainly to power factories that would rapidly increase Soviet Russia's economic and industrial output. But it wasn't just machines and tech that Lenin thought would accomplish this. He and many leading Bolsheviks borrowed lots of ideas from American engineer Frederick Winslow Taylor, who in a famous 1909 book described how tasks in a factory, including management, could be broken down into standardized, scientifically informed steps for maximum efficiency. This idea was often called scientific management, or Taylorism, named after Taylor himself. The Soviets ginned up their own version of Taylorism under a different name, but it was basically the same thing. They also borrowed heavily from the techniques of Henry Ford and American mass production. A crash plan to electrify the country by building scads of hydroelectric and thermoelectric power plants was one of the first major economic and social engineering plans instituted by the new Bolshevik state. It was called Goelro, Goelro, and was passed in 1920, while the Civil War was still going on. This plan continued on after Lenin died in early 1924, and Stalin, the one guy that Lenin did not want to succeed him, consolidated his control of the Soviet Union after a power struggle, principally with Trotsky. Goelro had some successes, but they were highly qualified successes. The linchpin of the plan was the massive Dniprostroi Dam in Ukraine, a huge hydroelectric station that started construction in 1927 and began generating electricity in 1932. The dam worked, but did not function as the Soviet Taylorist and Goelro plans anticipated. Workers didn't know how the machinery worked. There were bottlenecks in production, countless accidents involving people and machinery, and political conflicts among the workers and their managers. People who, whether innocently or deliberately, impeded progress or economic goals in projects like this one became ideological targets of Stalin. Wreckers, they were called. Thousands of people were accused of being wreckers during Stalin's purges in the late 1930s, and they were a brand of villain of the Soviet state, similar to the dreaded kulaks, or supposedly rich peasants, who stood in the way of Stalin's other major goal, the collectivization of agriculture across the Soviet Union. That story is probably beyond the scope of what I want to do in this video, but it is related to the cult of technology. One of the strains of Stalin's ideology was that mechanization, technology, would be one of the major tools of collectivization, allowing the ordinary peasants to crush the power of the kulaks and bring the Soviet Union into a golden age of agricultural as well as industrial production. What you're looking at on screen now are images from a Soviet propaganda film, The General Line, made in 1929 by Sergei Eisenstein, the landmark director who had done the battleship Potemkin and would later go on to direct the nationalist epic Alexander Nevsky. The general point of the film is how poor and backwards the Russian farming peasants are, until the revolution enables them to acquire the miraculous technology of a tractor, which transforms their lives and their farms into an idyllic paradise. In reality, Stalin's collectivization program was brutal and bloody, ultimately costing millions of lives. He charged ahead with his technological deterministic plans, regardless of how many corpses piled up, or how the lives and culture of the agricultural working class were disrupted or destroyed. A massive famine in Ukraine, called the Holodomor, occurred in 1932 and 33, against the backdrop of a wider famine across the Soviet Union, largely caused by Stalin's collectivization and crash industrialization programs. The Holodomor in particular was deliberately intended as punishment of the Ukrainian people for daring to resist the integration of their country, which is separate from Russia, into the Soviet Union, and also for dragging their feet and gumming up the works on his collectivization efforts. It was prominent among the many ghastly genocides that occurred during the 20th century. Transforming rivers and farms with technology and scientific management principles wasn't the extent of Stalin's vision. The more massive engineering projects he could force into being, and the faster they could be built, the better. And the more validation he could claim of the Bolsheviks' promises of creating, supposedly, a technologically advanced, abundant, and progressive society. The White Sea-Baltic Canal was another example of Stalin's murderous excess. This man-made canal was intended to connect two key waterways in the northern Soviet Union, not far from Leningrad. Begun in 1931, the canal was built by convict labor, men and women supplied from Stalin's labor camps, the infamous gulags, over 100,000 people. This was a political show as much as one of engineering. The idea was to showcase how former enemies of the state could supposedly redeem themselves by turning their labor toward a massive project on behalf of the state that punished them. At least 12,000 and possibly as many as 25,000 of these prisoners died from harsh conditions, overwork, and deliberate brutality during the construction of the White Sea-Baltic Canal. To give you an idea of what it was like, the guy in charge of the gulag who built it was Yenrik Yagoda, the amoral and possibly psychopathic secret police chief who greatly expanded the gulag system and helped launch Stalin's purges, until he himself was targeted in the purge and messily executed in 1936. Khrushchev, future leader of the Soviet Union, was also involved in the White Sea-Baltic Canal project. You can see him behind Yagoda in this photo, taken on the site of the canal in 1935. Despite all the inefficiency, brutality, political punishment, and mass death associated with the project, the White Sea-Baltic Canal was completed in just 20 months, opening in 1933, and Soviet officials continually pointed to it as an example of the technological, economic, and social successes of their system. Stalin finally croaked in 1953, having led, at the cost of tens of millions of lives, the Soviet Union to world power status. Khrushchev, who won the next power struggle to be Soviet leader, thought that technology and the strong-arm abilities of the Bolshevik state could lead the country to even higher accomplishments, specifically the conquest of space. Khrushchev was a huge booster of the Soviet space program, which on his watch did achieve the first human spaceflight in 1961, if not the first moon landing, though not for lack of trying. You could argue that the Soviets' pattern of more or less blind faith in their technology, coupled with a neglect of attention to its potential dangers, led to the ultimate technological catastrophe of the Soviet era, the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. This horrific nuclear accident was caused by negligence, bad procedures and management, and numerous technical errors. Exactly the factors that Taylorism, scientific management principles, were supposed to have abolished long ago. Nuclear technology, whether in weapons or in power generation, is an especially dangerous toy box to be playing around in, especially by people like the managers, commissars, and technocrats of the Soviet era, who tended to see the building of these technologies as ideological ends in themselves, and who were ready to justify almost any social, environmental, or human cost as the necessary price of capital P progress. This is absolutely the hallmark of the cult of technology. The Bolsheviks, though officially godless, certainly believed in the near deification of tech, and they paid an unusually steep price for it. When Gorbachev, the last Soviet leader, resigned on Christmas night, 1991, I seriously doubt he was thinking about what role the exuberant attitude his regime took toward technology played in the downfall of his government. But Chernobyl was a major step on the road to the ultimate collapse of Soviet-style communism. We don't have time to hit more than the surface basics of the story of the USSR's relationship with technology, but it could not go unmentioned in this analysis. On July 16, 1945, the Trinity test occurred in the desert outside Los Alamos, New Mexico. It was the first practical test of a nuclear weapon and the first nuclear explosion in history. The subject of the Manhattan Project and the development of the atomic bomb has been prominent in American popular consciousness recently, mainly because of the 2023 film Oppenheimer, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture. But it's never really been out of the public mind. Every few years, a book, film, TV, movie, or documentary keeps the story alive. I'm not going to retell that story here, even in capsule form, but the implications of Trinity and the Manhattan Project for technology and humanity's relationship to it are immense. The test marked the advent of the first machine in history capable of destroying the human race, and potentially built, at least in part, for that purpose. Society had come a long way in the 94 years since the Crystal Palace exhibition, with its glorious and beautiful machines meant to enrich and elevate civilization. Here now was a machine, one of whose purposes was to destroy civilization. To be sure, this kind of development wasn't unthinkable in the 19th century. Henry Adams, historian and descendant of John and John Quincy Adams, his brother Charles Francis Adams, who was active in the railroad business, popped up earlier in our story, had a famous quote, which he wrote in 1862 during the Civil War. Quote, "Man has mounted science and is now run away with. I firmly believe that before many centuries more, science will be the master of man. The engines he will have invented will be beyond his strength to control. Someday, science may have the existence of mankind in its power, and the human race commit suicide by blowing up the world." End quote. Before the world was blown up, it was Japan's turn. The atomic blasts at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 killed a lot of people, but not more than the horrendous casualties of previous bombing raids in World War II with conventional weapons, such as the firestorm over Tokyo in March 1945 that killed 100,000 people. But that took hundreds of planes and thousands of bombs. By contrast, the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was done with only 2 bombs, dropped by 2 aircraft flying alone. The destructive power of nuclear weapons was far beyond anything that had been developed before, and now humanity had to deal with it. There was a bit of cult of technology style thinking that went into the creation of the atomic bomb in the first place. In August 1939, Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, advising him of the theoretical possibility of atomic weapons. The letter hinted, but did not state openly, that Nazi Germany might be working on a bomb. Einstein merely noted that the Germans had stopped selling uranium from mines in Czechoslovakia that they had recently gained control of. But the implication was clear. and would have been even if the letter never mentioned Germany at all. The idea of a nuclear-armed Hitler was so viscerally frightening and so totally unacceptable that the only practical course of action was to develop one before he did. In 1939, and indeed not until the end of the war, no one among the Western Allies knew that Hitler's progress toward a nuclear weapon was slow and not a particular priority. In this case, the belief in the transformative power of technology was entirely justified. Even Einstein, who was a pacifist, would have agreed that going full bore on what became the Manhattan Project was imperative. But the thought of Hitler possessing such a weapon was about the only thing that could have justified it for him. Others said of Einstein years later that he admitted had he known Hitler wasn't very close to getting the bomb first, he, Einstein, would never have written the famous letter to FDR. So in the end, the atomic bomb, the world's most fearsome weapon, was built as a means to save the Western world from somebody much worse possessing that same weapon. Once it was ready, after Hitler had already been defeated, Truman, FDR's successor, saw the opportunity to bring the war against Japan to a quick end. The big question after Japan surrendered was, what now? What do we do with nuclear weapons once we've got them? Many of the scientists who had been involved with the Manhattan Project, or on the outskirts of it, including Einstein himself, argued the U.S. government should abolish nuclear weapons. They believed atomic weapons to be profoundly immoral, and the very existence of them a threat to the entire human species. But politics overrode any lingering sense of morality left in warfare, if there was any, by 1945. The problem with technology is that you can't uninvent it. Soviet spies were already hard at work trying to get their hands on the basics of America's bomb, and they succeeded. The USSR popped off its first nuke in the desert of Kazakhstan in 1949, thus giving Stalin, now the worst human being left in the world after Hitler's death, the ultimate weapon. The Cold War was now in full swing. As each side, the United States and the Soviet Union, stockpiled nuclear weapons and developed increasingly elaborate tools to deliver them, the whole world fell under the shadow of nuclear stalemate. Dwight Eisenhower, a consummate Cold Warrior, succeeded Truman. His main goal was to contain the Soviet Union and the communists at any cost, though he definitely preferred doing so at the lowest cost possible. He wanted above all things to avoid nuclear confrontation with them. There's plenty of evidence that Eisenhower was genuinely troubled by nuclear weapons and the possibilities of total destruction. Nevertheless, America's nuclear arsenal greatly increased on his watch. It was also during the 1950s that the U.S. federal government sought to justify nuclear technology, the terrible genie that Oppenheimer had unleashed, in the minds of the American public. There followed a fairly desperate search for positive applications of nuclear power and even nuclear weapons. The term atoms for peace was not a specific program delineated by the government, but rather sort of a general policy umbrella that covered a number of actual government efforts. The most obvious application of nuclear tech outside the sphere of weapons and warfare was power generation. Experiments with nuclear power ramped up in the U.S. in the early 1950s, but the first practical use of atomic reactors as a power source was, again, a military use, with the debut of the USS Nautilus in early 1954. Nuclear-powered civilian ships never really caught on. Ironically, the economics of them made them pretty much unworkable, as the Savannah, the U.S.'s first atomic-powered merchant vessel, proved after its launch in 1962. So that left power plants. I don't need to rehash the long debate in American society over nuclear power. It's been raging for decades now, and the arguments are pretty well known. The two biggest problems with nuclear power are what to do with the radioactive waste and how to minimize the dangers from accidents. The stakes are much higher if a nuclear power plant goes haywire than a conventionally powered one. 3 Mile Island in 1979, Chernobyl in 1986, and Fukushima in 2011 underscored those dangers. Despite wide adoption of nuclear power by some countries, especially France, I think it's safe to say that humanity's adoption of the technology has been pretty lukewarm. This makes nuclear technology kind of an outlier in humanity's experience with technology. It's one of the few forms of tech that people generally aren't eager to use on a wide scale. So, when it comes to nukes, weapons are obviously bad and power generation is kind of a hard sell. Is there anything else that nukes can be used for? The US government tried its best to come up with something, anything, to get the public on the side of the atom. One of the most ludicrous attempts at this was a boondoggle called Operation Plowshare, its very name being a propaganda tool. The idea was, hey, why don't we use nuclear weapons in construction projects to dig really big holes? The Soviet Union also developed a similar program. On July 6, 1962, the bright fellows from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory popped off a 104-kiloton nuke in the Nevada desert as a demonstration of the marvelous excavating power of nuclear weapons. This test, called Sedan, blew a hole 320 feet deep at the Yucca Flat site near Mercury, Nevada, and hoisted about 11 megatons of dirt into the air. It also spewed nuclear fallout as far east as Virginia and exposed 11 million people to nuclear radiation. By 1962, the government's repeated claims that the results of its nuclear testing were completely safe. It's just like a chest x-ray. We're wearing pretty thin. Ask the residents of St. George, Utah, what nuclear testing in the 1950s did to them. Children who weren't even born when the tests occurred were dying of exotic cancers well into the 1980s. Nuclear testing probably killed John Wayne, Susan Hayward, Agnes Moorehead, and numerous other people from Hollywood who shot the 1956 mega turkey, The Conqueror, in Utah. The film's producers, which included Howard Hughes, unfortunately bought the government's chest x-ray malarkey. The lingering effects of what historians sometimes call the nuclear West are beyond our scope here, except to note that this is what the US government was trying to justify with idiotic experiments like the Sedan blast. Incidentally, there were no further such tests after that. Not only was no one buying the premise of Operation Plowshare, but the Atmospheric Nuclear Test Ban Treaty went into effect the next year, 1963. You may have noticed that nuclear weapons are not, to this day, widely used in heavy construction projects. At least somebody learned something from history. The ghastly nuclear toy box, which has turned formerly innocuous place names like Hiroshima, Chernobyl, and Fukushima into synonyms for disaster and mass death, is part and parcel of the cult of technology. For reasons that were admittedly hard to argue with in 1942, Oppenheimer fulfilled Henry Adams's prophecy by building a machine that the human race could use to commit suicide. That we have not, as of yet, used it for that specific purpose isn't much of a comfort. As movies like Dr. Strangelove, The Day After, and War Games remind us, all it takes is one guy who momentarily feels justified in pushing a button. In case that's not frightening enough, Terminator 2 raised the stakes by pointing out that it doesn't necessarily have to be a person who does it. Someday, an artificial intelligence might do it for us. Hold that thought. We're not quite there yet. On July 20th, 1969, exactly 100 years, 2 months, and 10 days after the driving of the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, Utah, which completed the Transcontinental Railroad, two Americans, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, landed on the surface of the moon. The moonshot, as it was called at the time, and still sometimes is, was every bit the 20th century equivalent in terms of an engineering and technological challenge, as the building of the Transcontinental Railroad had been in the 19th century. The moon landing fulfilled the famous call by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 to land humans on the moon and return them safely to the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It was to be, as he pointed out, a major milestone in humans' exploration of space. But it came out of a specifically Cold War context. As I mentioned in Chapter 7, the Soviets were all in on space exploration, trying to one-up the United States in various firsts in space. And in the beginning, they were well ahead, lofting Yuri Gagarin into orbit in April 1961, several weeks before the first American astronaut, Alan Shepard, got off the launch pad. As impressive as it was, and as much rumination as it sparked on subjects of human achievement, unity, and peaceful technological advancement, I don't think you can separate the moon program from its military context. The rockets that took 24 Americans to the moon between 1968 and 1972 were developed from and based on the original designs for intercontinental nuclear missiles, which themselves springboarded from missile technology developed during World War II by the Nazis. Wernher von Braun, America's chief rocket scientist in the 1950s and 60s, had been a Nazi. The V-2 rockets that fell silently on London in 1944 and 45 were his creation. The American triumph on the moon in 1969 was linked directly to the cult of technology as it was practiced within Hitler's Third Reich. The Soviets never got to the moon, but their space program also springboarded from former Nazi tech. Indeed, the people with the capability to build this kind of technology were welcomed and protected by both the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations generally overlooked the war crimes that these Nazi engineers had been involved in because they wanted their technological expertise for the nuclear arms race and eventually the space exploration race. One thing that's often overlooked when we talk about the U.S. effort to reach the moon was that it occurred against the backdrop of and reached its climax at the same time as America's involvement in the Vietnam War. You might think of Vietnam as a low-tech, low-intensity conflict, a bunch of troops slogging it out in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And while it was decidedly low-tech for the Vietnamese, it was never low-intensity, and the United States tried hard to bring its technological advantages to bear in its favor. For Americans, Vietnam was in fact a high-tech war. U.S. military planners, from the somewhat obtuse General William Westmoreland on down, sought a technological solution to the tactical advantages that the North Vietnamese naturally had on the ground in Southeast Asia. Why are helicopters, particularly the Bell UH-1 series, usually called the Huey, one of the most universally recognized images of the Vietnam War? You see them in every single Vietnam movie. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now uses helicopters as a visual and auditory motif. I can't tell you how many times I've shown this photo in my various videos over the years. It's even on my website. Why? Well, one of the main tactics adopted by the U.S. military as direct American combat involvement in the war began in 1965 was to deliver troops by air to specific points, engage the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong enemy on the ground in short, intense battles, and then get the troops out. Helicopters like the Huey were heavily utilized for that purpose. Americans had helicopters in Vietnam, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong didn't. Technological advantage. Of course, in the end, it didn't work. American technology couldn't overwhelm the strategic advantages that the Vietnamese naturally possessed. To win the war, Americans had to preserve South Vietnam from infiltration and attack indefinitely, most likely by totally destroying the capability of North Vietnam to try to take it over. On their side, all the North Vietnamese had to do to win the war was to wait until the Americans got tired and went home. That is exactly what happened. No amount of technology could have won Vietnam for the United States. It just couldn't have worked. But American policymakers were pretty slow to grasp that lesson, or if they did know it deep down, they pretended as if they didn't. Take, for example, the chief civilian architect of the war, Robert McNamara, who's made an appearance in several of my past videos. If there was ever a high priest of the cult of technology, McNamara was it. He was so calculating and technically minded, just in his basic personality, that Barry Goldwater, later Lyndon Johnson's opponent in the 1964 presidential election, referred to McNamara as, quote, an IBM machine with legs. That was a pretty apt description. During his tenure at Ford Motor Company, before he became John F. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, McNamara pushed the Ford company to adopt computers to crunch statistical data and come up with new product and investment strategies, as well as streamline the company itself and its production processes for maximum efficiency. Remember Frederick Winslow Taylor and the system of scientific management that the Soviets fell so in love with? Taylorism, much more than any political ideology, was the defining principle of McNamara's professional life. He brought this same principle to the Department of Defense in 1961, at a time when America's involvement in Vietnam was deepening. During the 1960s, under McNamara's leadership, the Pentagon heavily utilized computers. The best ones at the time were made by IBM, International Business Machines. Anyway, the Pentagon used them to crunch, analyze, and synthesize as much data about the conflict in Vietnam as could be fed into the primitive spreadsheets that the computers emitted. Not only information about troop strength, supplies, and potential targets were fed into the Pentagon's IBM punch card systems, but McNamara tried to use computers to analyze what you might call the qualitative factors affecting the war, such as how much of the countryside and how many Vietnamese peasants supposedly supported South Vietnam and the United States, and how many were loyal to the Viet Cong and the idea of a unified Vietnam under communist rule, as if loyalty or ideology or nationalism were constant variables that could be parsed by a computer. Look, for example, at this astounding graph, which emerged from a Department of Defense computer in the spring of 1968. It's called Hamlet Evaluation System Population Control. The Pentagon defined the smallest cohesive community in Vietnam as a quote-unquote hamlet, meaning a small village or part of a village. According to these graphs, which classify hamlets in 4 core zones as secure, contested, or VC, meaning loyal to the Viet Cong, South Vietnam and the United States are clearly winning the battle for what was called the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese peasantry. Look, in 3 out of 4 zones, more than half the hamlets are classified secure. That must mean we're winning, right? But note the date on this document, April 30th, 1968. That was after the Tet Offensive, which changed the minds of many American policymakers about whether the war was being won, or even if that was possible. Clearly, by April 1968, the United States was losing, but the computers kept hope alive in the minds of those who trusted them to help them win the war. Take, for another example, Robert Comer, a National Security Council staffer who was put in charge of the effort to win over Vietnam's villages to the American side. In a press conference in December 1967, Comer said of the computer data crunching efforts, quote, "The problem we faced was how to keep track of what's going on in about 12,650 hamlets in Vietnam on a monthly basis. This led us to use computers, because if we didn't automate the system, we would never be able to process the mountain of data that you get from trying to assemble, let's say, 30 different items a month on 12,650 hamlets in Vietnam. The computers also provide us with some flexibility. We can ask the computer questions on details among the 30 different facets and get answers of any kind." End quote. Look at that last sentence. It almost sounds like someone talking about using an AI interface like ChatGPT, doesn't it? Foreshadowing? In the same month as Comer made this statement, President Lyndon Johnson awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his efforts in the Vietnam War. So, what does this have to do with the Apollo moonshot, aside from the fact that it was going on at the same time? Well, simply this. The kind of computer technology that was deployed in both the space program and the efforts to win, or to convince people that we were winning, the Vietnam War, emerged out of a triad of powerful institutions working closely together. The federal government, usually the Department of Defense or NASA, universities and academia, usually leaders in STEM fields, and private industry, most commonly defense contractors. There was an interlocking directorate of people who floated freely between these three institutions, a sort of revolving door between them. Most computer experts in the federal government had worked previously at universities or at private defense contractors or companies like IBM. When they left government, such as when there was a change of political party, like the transition between Johnson and Nixon in 1969, many of these people went back to work in the private sector or wound up back in university classrooms. The triad of Pentagon, defense contractors, and academia supplied the technology for both the Apollo moonshot and the effort to win the Vietnam War. They were two sides of the same coin, twin efforts joined at the hip, or even closer. What was the fundamental ideology that underlay all of it? Not political ideology, Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal. It was the idea of the cult of technology, that tech and machines and engineering could and would transform society for the better. Whether that transformation took the form of an American flag planted on the surface of the moon, or a most assuredly non-communist flag flying over the presidential palace in Saigon, it was basically the same idea. One more thing about this period, the late Vietnam era. Another important innovation emerged from the same triad of Pentagon, defense contractors, and academia, specifically in 1969, that critical year of transition. It was called ARPANET, an interconnected computer network. As many people know, ARPANET was the genesis of the modern internet. We're going to get to that in chapter 11 briefly. But first, let's turn to some of the other consequences of the cult of technology, specifically environmental consequences. In 1856, just 5 years after the Crystal Palace exhibition, Eunice Newton Foote, a feminist, suffragist, and amateur scientist from New York State, submitted a scientific paper for inclusion in the American Association for the Advancement of Science 10th annual meeting, which occurred in Albany that year. Her paper was titled Circumstances Affecting the Heat of the Sun's Rays, and it reported her experiments with how different gases affected heat generated by sunlight. Foote's experiments noted that a cylinder filled with carbon dioxide, known then as carbonic acid gas, became hotter and cooled slower than other control cylinders. Simply put, Foote had discovered the greenhouse effect, global warming. Until fairly recently, an Irish scientist, John Tyndall, was generally credited with the discovery of the greenhouse effect 3 years later, in 1859. But historians have confirmed that Eunice Newton Foote did it first. As often happens in science, a man got the credit for a woman's discovery. But Tyndall's experiments definitely confirmed what Foote had already demonstrated. There was something inherent in carbon dioxide that trapped heat in the air. In 1896, Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish electrochemist, published a paper called On the Influence of Carbonic Acid in the Air Upon the Temperature of the Ground. He concluded, quote, if the quantity of carbonic acid, CO2, increases in geometric progression, the augmentation of the temperature will increase nearly in arithmetic progression. End quote. In other words, if the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere increased, you would see an increase in global temperatures, with a mathematical relationship to the amount of increase. Now remember that. It becomes important later. Arrhenius was the first scientist to link global warming to the burning of fossil fuels from industrial processes. If his work from 1896 didn't make that linkage explicit, he had certainly done so by 1908. Various other scientists, T.C. Chamberlain, Guy Callender, and such, made further incremental discoveries in the science of global warming. But the irrefutable proof of it, the undeniable human fingerprint on global warming, came in the late 1950s, and this is it. This is the famous Keeling curve. It's a measurement of the amount of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere, year by year, measured from an observatory in Hawaii. It has a sawtooth appearance because CO2 varies by season of the year, but the aggregate figures show an undeniable, steady increase. Furthermore, the specific isotopes of CO2 that are increasing are exactly the ones that are given off by the burning of carbon-based fuels, fossil fuels, and not the isotopes given off by the normal and natural decay of carbon matter. In other words, there's simply no question that human activity is putting more and more CO2 into the atmosphere. And when matched with the voluminous research on the increase in temperatures since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there is no scientific doubt that human activity is warming the climate. Remember what Arrhenius said in 1896? If the quantity of carbonic acid, CO2, increases in geometric progression, the augmentation of the temperature will increase nearly in arithmetic progression. Indeed, all the data on climate change for the past 120 years shows that Arrhenius was exactly right. What does this have to do with the cult of technology? Well, simply put, global warming is the ultimate consequence of the Industrial Revolution. Most technology that's been developed since the beginning of the 19th century has depended on fossil fuels to one degree or another, coal and petroleum mostly. Renewable resources have been ramping up fairly recently, but historically the vast majority of what we've built, from railroads to automobiles to computers to moon rockets, ultimately runs on some kind of fossil fuel power. The scientific proof of human-caused global warming was not controversial until the later 1980s. It was, and always has been, a mainstream theory supported by virtually all scientific work done on the subject. By virtually all, I mean north of 99%, not 97%. That's an outdated number. No, I'm not going to get into individual denialist arguments, which are all complete nonsense. Yes, every single one of them. The deniers in the audience, if there are any left by this point, are welcome to go watch cat videos anytime they want to. President Lyndon Johnson was briefed on human-caused global warming, which was then mostly known as the greenhouse problem, in 1965. By the 1970s, scientists employed by the major oil companies, including Exxon, were studying the greenhouse problem themselves. Here is one of their documents, a famous one by a scientist called James Black. Look there at the summary, which is entirely supported by the scientific material in the main text. CO2 release most likely source of inadvertent climate modification. Prevailing opinion attributes CO2 increase to fossil fuel combustion. Doubling CO2 could increase average global temperatures 1 to 3 degrees Celsius by 2050. End quote. This document dates from 1978. Today, in 2025, we're right on that track, meaning that Exxon's own scientists got it exactly right nearly 50 years ago. The Earth is warming, and Exxon, as well as other fossil fuel companies, were causing it. There are many documents Exxon produced that are smoking guns, but this one is among the most stark and the least deniable. The uncertainties in climate science and climate modeling, which deniers have made a lot of, did exist, but they surrounded the questions of how much and how fast are fossil fuels warming the planet, not uncertainties about whether it's happening or what's causing it. Let me repeat that. The uncertainties pertain to the effect and timescale of global warming, not its existence and not whether human activity was responsible for it. Those questions are, and at least since the development of the Keeling curve, have been absolutely settled. Somebody somewhere is going to claim that global warming is irrelevant to the subject of this video. Now that's wrong, and here's why. It's extremely relevant. Global warming is an existential threat to the ideology underlying the cult of technology. If the awesome power to transform society for the better that is inherent in technology is built mostly on the exploitation of fossil fuels, which it is, and global warming means serious and catastrophic disruptions to the Earth's environment and human activities in it, which it does, is there a more compelling reason to doubt that technology is always or usually a net positive for society? Admittedly, that's more of a philosophical question than a historical one, but it definitely explains why oil companies and other economic interests tied to fossil fuels decided on what they did next. In 1988, George H.W. Bush, who I always call Bush the First, ran for President of the United States. Now, he was not a global warming denier. In fact, he referred explicitly to what he called the greenhouse effect in various campaign speeches. For example, Bush said at a 1988 campaign stop, quote,
"We all know that human activities are changing the atmosphere in unexpected and in unprecedented ways."
Unequivocal acceptance of the proven scientific consensus that warming was happening and humans are causing it. This issue, however, was not a priority for Bush, and his acknowledgement of global warming went down the memory hole after he took office in early 1989, as did many other campaign pledges.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
At that same moment in time, fossil fuel interests saw a strategic opportunity to ensconce denial of the proven scientific fact of human-caused global warming as official U.S. government policy. The White House was, in the early days of the Bush administration, flooded with think tank publications, letters, and propaganda pieces casting doubt on climate science and emphasizing how any government action on climate change would be inimical to the fossil fuel and energy interests' bottom lines. I've seen many of these documents with my own eyes, preserved at the Bush Presidential Library. The oil companies and industry boosters had clearly decided by this point to protect their own bottom lines, at the cost of destroying the climate by trying to sabotage governmental efforts to address global warming for as long as possible, decades if necessary. Exxon's own internal documents show that in 1988 and 1989, the company embarked on a deliberate policy to inject doubt into the minds of the public and politicians about climate science. This campaign was similar to and engineered by many of the same people who had worked on the tobacco industry's misinformation campaign designed to cast doubt on whether smoking caused cancer. Some of the same hacks that sold Ronald Reagan on the ludicrous idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative in the 1980s were reborn as global warming deniers. Frederick Seitz, for example, former head of the National Academy of Sciences, who was a Triple Crown winner in this regard, promoting cigarette cancer causation denial, SDI, and global warming denial at various times in his career. As I said earlier, Bush the First was not a global warming denier himself, but he outsourced virtually all responsibility for White House policy on the environment to John Sununu, his chief of staff, who definitely was a global warming denier. As the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was finalizing its groundbreaking report on global warming in the spring of 1990, Sununu tried to negotiate with the IPCC to get it to soften its conclusions and water down its language. He failed. That failure seems to have been a bitter pill for him to swallow. For the rest of his tenure as chief of staff, Sununu was extraordinarily hostile to any suggestion to deal with the issue on a policy level, and he sought to inject doubt about the proven science of global warming and its causation into policy wherever possible. Sununu was eventually cashiered from the White House as a result of an unrelated scandal in late 1991 involving his waste of public money to pay for private travel perks. The effect of all of this was that for all practical purposes, global warming denial became entrenched as U.S. federal government policy. Bush's defeat in 1992 by Bill Clinton, who did care about the global warming issue, didn't change things as much as you might think. Most of Clinton's efforts were aimed at getting an international agreement on the limitation of greenhouse gas emissions, the Kyoto Accords, which did come together, sort of, in 1997. But both Clinton and his successor, George Bush II, refused to submit the Kyoto Treaty to the Senate for ratification, which effectively gutted it. I explained a few minutes ago why the existence of human-caused global warming is an existential threat to the ideas that underpin the cult of technology. Fossil fuels cause global warming, period. End of story. To beat global warming, we must eliminate fossil fuels, period. End of story. Considering how deeply fossil fuels are ingrained in the world economy, even the countries that profess to take the issue seriously have a great deal to lose, economically and politically, by doing something about it. It's much easier and more psychologically satisfying to deny that the problem exists than to try seriously to deal with it. The thing about global warming, though, is that it doesn't care whether or not you believe in it, or how deeply you might believe in the transformative power of technology. The advance of the climate crisis is as inexorable as the dawn. That is by now historical as well as scientific fact. In the mid to late 1970s, the personal computer revolution began, mainly with Apple, the San Francisco Bay Area company that began out of a garage and eventually became one of the richest and most powerful companies in history. The origin stories of companies like Apple and Microsoft and their associated demigods, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, are well known. This is an ad from a Minnesota newspaper in 1982, advertising 3 different kinds of computers on one page alone. My family got our first computer, an Apple IIe, for Christmas in 1983, and we were late adopters. Computers were everywhere in the 1980s. Eventually, within the next 20 years, the tech industry had sold not just a desktop computer to almost every family in the Western world with the financial means to buy one, but a pocket-sized computer to almost every individual person who wanted one. The spread of computers on a household and personal level fueled the creation and massive growth of what we now recognize as the tech industry. Apple Inc. went public on December 12, 1980, with its stock price at $22 per share, $85.10 in the equivalent 2024 dollars. On the day I wrote this portion of the script, Apple's stock was trading at $278.85 per share. The tech industry growth between 1980 and 2025 is one of the biggest financial booms in history. In addition to putting a computer in almost every pocket, a computer far more powerful than the largest IBM-built computers used by the Department of Defense in the Vietnam era, this aggressive growth had another effect too. It created in the minds of the shareholders and the financial markets a sense of entitlement and expectation that the value of technology companies and their shares would always and should always grow on that unprecedented and exponential scale. Number go up is a law of modern economics, but in the tech business, it could be expressed as number go way, way, way up forever. This sense of entitlement, this expectation that tech stocks should always be doing what they were doing between 1980 and 2025, turns out to be important in the recent history of the cult of technology. So now we get to the internet, which is why we're all here and why you're able to watch me. The World Wide Web went public on April 30th, 1993. Though it happened in April, users on Usenet, the network that existed from the early days of the internet before the debut of the World Wide Web, coined the term Eternal September to refer to the sudden influx of inexperienced people suddenly using Usenet, once early internet service providers started granting access to it. Before the web, this phenomenon would only happen in September, when new college students first discovered Usenet at their university computer labs. The first email I ever sent was from a university computer lab. It was in 1991, not 93, so I guess I was ahead of the curve for the first and possibly only time in my life regarding anything technological. The development of the early internet coincided with an economic boom in the United States and many other countries. After the recession of the early 80s was over, the American stock market consistently reached new highs throughout the 80s and 90s. Now, there were some bumps along that road, obviously, such as the massive and somewhat mysterious stock market crash of October 1987. And the recession of the early 1990s, which was more responsible than any other single factor in bringing Bill Clinton to power after 12 years of Reagan-Bush Republican political dominance. After the recovery from the early 90s recession, the bull market continued. The Cold War was over, the Federal Reserve was keeping interest rates down, and the supply of money and cheap credit was plentiful. There was no time like it in American economic history since the 1920s. Of course, we all know how that ended. There were so many milestones on the road to the dot-com bubble. I could fill a video twice as long as this one with them. The foundation of Wired magazine by Louis Rossetto in 1993, the release of Netscape Navigator, not the first web browser, but the one that brought more people to the web than anything that had come before it, the popularity of America Online,
You've got mail.
the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Websites were proliferating everywhere. The first mini-bubble, at least insofar as Wall Street was concerned, was in the stocks of ISPs, Internet Service Providers. Take, for example, the case of Netcom Online Communications Services, which is a small ISP founded in 1988, incorporated in 1992. In December 1994, Netcom went public with 1.85 million shares issued at $13 a share. Wall Street gobbled it up, raking in $85 million. Netcom, which you've probably never heard of, had about 42,000 users. That meant that Wall Street was basically valuing each of Netcom's users at $2,100. Netcom's users paid $20 a month for access. Overvalued? Yeah, just a little, right? Yet Netcom was eventually sold to Mindspring for $245 million, and Mindspring eventually merged with Earthlink, forming a company that was, at the time of the merger, worth $3.9 billion. Yes, billion with a B. This kind of exuberance became the norm in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street throughout the latter half of the 1990s. Let's take another example that didn't end so happily. CyberCash Inc., founded in the summer of 1994, was a company that developed software that would enable merchants to take credit card payments securely. In early 1996, the company went public, with stocks marketed by the investment bank Morgan Stanley. Shares were initially offered at $17 per. Within a week, shares of CyberCash were trading at $50. What were CyberCash's revenues at that time? Zero. They hadn't made a single dime. In fact, the company was $10 million in debt at the time it went public. Standard & Poor's, the most important Wall Street credit rating agency, refused to recommend CyberCash. An S&P analyst told a financial publication, quote, "The lack of any sales was a major negative in our rating," end quote. Gee, you think? In 1996, a man called Barton Biggs, chairman of Morgan Stanley's asset management division, told a British financial reporter, quote, "You've got stocks selling at absolutely unbelievable multiples of earnings and revenues. You've got companies going public that don't even have any earnings. You've got people setting up internet pages to reinforce each other's convictions in these highly speculative stocks. This is wild stuff out of the past," end quote. The Federal Reserve encouraged the bubble. Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan, appointed by Ronald Reagan just months before the stock market crash of October 1987, refused to raise interest rates, at least at first, which might have tempered some of Wall Street's excess. Greenspan was reappointed several times by Bush I, Bill Clinton, and Bush II. Ideologically, Greenspan was a right-wing libertarian and a devoted acolyte of Russian-born novelist Ayn Rand, who died in 1982. Rand was the author of two of the most turgid and impenetrable books ever written, The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, which sought to justify capitalism not just in economic and political terms, but moral ones. These books influenced not only Greenspan, but a generation of young economic conservatives who eventually saturated into the culture of Silicon Valley and the tech industry. As the dot-com bubble inflated, there was a real sense among a lot of people, Wall Street titans, financial writers, politicians, etc., that the internet and newly ascendant computer technology had permanently altered the laws of economics. A famous article appeared in the Wall Street Journal in May 1999 that suggested that companies now considered the concept of profits as quaint. I graduated from law school in 1998. My first job after that was at a business law firm in Portland, Oregon. Not Silicon Valley, but what was sometimes called the Silicon Forest. At that time, tech startups were thought of as highly desirable clients. This despite the fact that they could rarely pay their legal bills in cash, at least not for very long, because they weren't making any money. Venture capital was how these companies stayed afloat until they could IPO if they got that far. The term burn rate, meaning how fast a tech startup could waste the money that venture capitalists had pumped into it before it collapsed, became popular in this era. You've probably heard of some of the ludicrous dot-com ideas that were proliferating around the turn of the century. Some famously bought airtime at the Super Bowl in 2000. Pets.com was known for its deliberately silly advertising featuring an obnoxious sock puppet that screeched, cracked wise, and occasionally sang old songs by KC and the Sunshine Band. Webvan, a company that proposed to deliver everything, but especially groceries, to customers' homes once they ordered them on the internet, guzzled $396 million of venture capitalist money, went public in November 1999, and promptly flopped when its customer churn proved abnormally high, and the market realized that its founders didn't have a clue what they were doing. Two very curious startups were Beans.com and Flues.com, the latter of which was publicized in ads by Academy Award-winning actress Whoopi Goldberg. These sites offered what was essentially a form of digital currency that users could accumulate by shopping online with partner retailers. This was 8 to 10 years before cryptocurrency was a thing. Sure enough, Flues.com was promptly appropriated by Russian gangsters for use in various criminal money laundering schemes. I hate to keep saying it, but foreshadowing? Greenspan and the Federal Reserve finally started to poke at the bubble. The Fed raised interest rates very slightly, a few times in 1999. But another modest hike in February 2000, coupled with a speech that Greenspan had recently given, in which he finally began to suggest that the economy might be overheating, was one of the contributors to the crash that happened. In March 2000, several mini crashes occurred in the financial markets, particularly the NASDAQ exchange. The real bloodbath was on April 14th, 2000, a Friday. The NASDAQ suffered the worst week in its history up to that time. The Dow Jones average fell more than 600 points. The specific trigger was apparently a Department of Labor report on rising consumer prices. It wasn't just tech stocks that were sold off. Major blue chip stocks representing the old economy got hosed too. In all, the financial bloodbath of April 14th put an end to 5 weeks of heavy selling. It was over. The bubble had popped. There were some survivors, of course. Undoubtedly, the most prominent of them was Amazon.com, which had started as an online bookstore. Though it lost nearly 30% of its value in the bloodbath of March and April 2000, Amazon, as we all know, lived to fight another day. And ironically, in this decade, seems to have made a successful go at the business model that Webvan couldn't pull off. But the fallout was pretty ugly. Corporate scandals like Enron and WorldCom followed over the next months and years. An iconic symbol of the dot-com bust was the famous Aeron office chair, which sold for $1,000 in the late 1990s, and which were bought en masse by tech startups for their hip offices full of young computer nerds and marketing people. There are famous reports of people seeing piles of derelict Aeron chairs from the offices of bankrupt startups after the disaster. But somehow Aeron itself managed to survive. The chair is a punchline, but chances are pretty good that if you've worked at an office any time in the present century, you've probably sat on one at least once. There are few clearer examples of the cult of technology than the dot-com boom and bust. While it's undeniable that the internet and the age of personal technology have radically changed the world economy, the investors, venture capitalists, and Wall Street pirates of 1998 and 99 acted as if that transformation was already complete, when in reality it had only just begun. The true maturation of the technological economy manifested itself not in dumb websites like Pets.com and Flues.com, but in the social media giants like Facebook that came up in the years following the crash. And of course, the fiber. During the boom, hundreds of thousands of miles of fiber optic cables were laid under, it seemed for a time, every street in America, preparing for vastly increased internet traffic that simply didn't exist in 1998 to justify the vast expenditures to put it there. Kind of like the railroads in the 1880s, yeah? Well, we have, in the quarter century since the dot-com disaster, come to use up all or most of what was once called dark fiber, so there's that. But like the railroads, the examples of the good that came out of the bubble don't automatically justify the costs and the downsides. The cult of technology, as you recall, has as its basic axiom the idea that technological development leads to capital P progress, and that it's always good in the long run. That might be as hard a sell to the millions who lost their jobs after the crash as it was to the families of the victims of the Titanic or the Native American nations dispossessed by the railroad. Whatever technology's benefits are, and there are many, somebody, somewhere, pays a heavy price for them. Easily the most mysterious figure in our story is a human referred to as Satoshi Nakamoto. Because no one is entirely sure who he is, or was, or even if he's still alive, we have no idea what he looked like. But that didn't stop some Hungarian crypto fans from creating this statue of him. In 2007, this person, whoever he was, began writing some code, and the following year uploaded a paper to a cryptography mailing list unveiling his creation, Bitcoin, a quote, trustless digital currency. Despite the numerous ridiculous stock images you see around the internet, Bitcoins aren't physical objects. In Nakamoto's conception, a Bitcoin would be created by having a computer solve a bunch of cryptographic puzzles. And when your computer does enough busy work, you'll be awarded a Bitcoin, or a part of one. The transactions and the busy work would be chronicled, set in stone basically, on a data ledger called the blockchain, which is thought to be secure because you can't tamper with the blockchain. The idea of what we now call cryptocurrency had been around for a while, batted about in papers and on mailing lists among computer nerds and people hanging around the fringes of the Silicon Valley tech culture. We already mentioned some of the forerunners, flues and beans.com, in the last chapter, although they are not very important in the history of crypto. What is important is that the whole idea came out of a political ideology. The notion that traditional money is controlled by governments and for that reason is inherently untrustworthy and corrupt. Those political ideas had been percolating throughout most of the 20th century, and even before that. The populists of the 1890s, remember them, we mentioned them in chapter 4, were extremely concerned, even obsessed, you might say, with money and how it worked. A great deal of mishigas in that period resulted over arguments about what the American money system should be backed by, gold or silver or both or one but not the other. When major world currencies were largely backed by gold, there were problems. For example, when World War I broke out in Europe in the summer of 1914, American bankers lent so much money to the warring parties, particularly Britain, that President Woodrow Wilson had to intervene to stop vast shipments of gold bullion from leaving the United States because it was depleting the Treasury's gold reserves. Almost every major world economy moved away from the gold standard in the period between the two world wars, as the Great Depression demonstrated again what an awful idea the gold standard was. A watered-down version of it remained under what was called the Bretton Woods system, developed during World War II. But U.S. President Richard Nixon put a stake through the heart of that when, in 1971, he ended the convertibility of the U.S. dollar to any amount of gold. The gold standard was in serious decline long before 1971, but Nixon just bowed to the inevitable. There remained, after 1971, a small but vocal group of economic diehards who continued to insist, despite all evidence to the contrary, that the gold standard was the best and only way to anchor a currency. This group overlapped to some degree with believers in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that the Federal Reserve and a shadowy group of Jewish bankers not so secretly control the world's money supply. The John Birch Society, a conspiracy cult that was popular in the United States, especially in the 1950s and 60s, heavily promoted these sorts of ideas. Nakamoto's idea of Bitcoin seems to have been intended, at least in part, as fulfillment of these fever dreams. Wouldn't it be great if there was a virtual currency not controlled by a government or a group of bankers that would function very much like gold? That was because Nakamoto decreed that there would only ever be a finite number of Bitcoins. Scarcity, after all, is the sine qua non of a valuable commodity. So Bitcoin was supposed to be like gold, except it was all on a computer somewhere. Nakamoto himself vanished after an email exchange in 2011 and has never been heard from again. He may be dead. I am profoundly uninterested in who Satoshi Nakamoto actually is or was. Guessing his identity has become sort of an internet parlor game. There are about 1 million Bitcoins still in Nakamoto's digital wallet, which have been untouched since 2010. If he was still alive and around, he'd be a billionaire many times over, at least on paper. After all, he was the founder and earliest adopter. The early adopters of a pyramid scheme are the ones, usually the only ones, who end up profiting from it. Bitcoin's founding and infancy coincided with the deepest days of the Great Recession, the next major financial crisis after the dot-com disaster. I'm not going to discuss that one as a symptom of the cult of technology, because it wasn't specifically based on tech. But between 2008 and 2011, when the world economy cratered after the subprime mortgage and housing bubbles burst, the idea that money was broken as an institution and merely a vehicle for enriching elites was hot. American politician Ron Paul, nominally a Republican but actually a libertarian, had a brief burst of popularity in this period. Remember Ayn Rand? Alan Greenspan's favorite author, and the impenetrable doorstop tomes she wrote, like Atlas Shrugged. It's no coincidence that it was in this same period, the Great Recession, that libertarians went all in on the idea of Bitcoin. Cryptocurrency was a tech cult object with explicitly political appeal, and because of that, Bitcoin fans behaved a lot like religious fanatics. Indeed, Bruce Wagner, a noted Bitcoin promoter, told Wired magazine, quote, "Bitcoin enthusiasts are almost evangelists. They see the beauty of the technology. It's a huge movement. It's almost like a religion. On the forum, you'll see the spirit. It's not just me, me, me. It's what's for the betterment of Bitcoin." End quote. That definitely sounds like someone deep in the thrall of the cult of technology. The many practical problems with Bitcoin and why it can't and doesn't work as a real form of currency are beyond the scope of this video. There's plenty written on this topic. One aspect of it that is worth mentioning is its grotesque environmental cost. Remember all that computer busy work, solving cryptographic puzzles and such, that's needed to create Bitcoins or mine them, as the parlance goes? What this means is that dedicated Bitcoin miners were incentivized to run massive banks of computers 24 hours a day, all the time, to do the busy work and generate Bitcoins. Bitcoin mining rigs draw vast amounts of power that could otherwise be used for more productive purposes. The more valuable Bitcoin gets, the more miners will be incentivized to have racks of computers churning away at the busy work, and the more power that they'll draw. The vast majority of that power is generated ultimately by fossil fuels, which cause global warming. So Bitcoin is essentially a toy currency, play money, secured by ongoing and irreparable harm to the world's climate. Don't get me wrong, despite it being notoriously difficult to transmute Bitcoin into real money that people will actually give real value for, as well as the insecure nature of Bitcoin wallets, which can be easily hacked or stolen, you can actually buy real things in the real world with Bitcoin. Drugs, for instance. In 2011, a man called Ross Ulbricht, a devotee of libertarian economics and politics who had volunteered for Ron Paul's doomed 2008 presidential campaign, started a site on the dark web called the Silk Road. No, not that Silk Road. This one was a mostly anonymous marketplace where people could buy or sell whatever they wanted, usually with anonymity, and pay in Bitcoin. Ulbricht made no secret of his politics and that he saw the Silk Road as a means of advancing the cause of anarcho-capitalism. That's the form of anarchism for people who've never heard of Emma Goldman. In its heyday in 2013, 70% of the products for sale on the Silk Road were drugs. Fake passports and IDs for use in criminal enterprises were another popular category of items. Ulbricht skimmed commissions off the top, at one point raking in $30,000 a month. He wasn't as smart as he thought he was, though, preserving most of the Silk Road transaction records and detailed records of his own crimes on a laptop. In September 2013, federal agents working a sting operation snatched Ulbricht's laptop at this public library in San Francisco. In 2015, he went on trial for numerous charges, including money laundering and narcotics conspiracy. The prosecutors alleged that he'd ordered hits on various enemies, none of which were actually carried out. Those particular charges were eventually dropped, but he was convicted on the others. Ulbricht was sent up for 2 life sentences plus 40 years without the possibility of parole. The effort to free him became a pet cause of the libertarian movement. In 2024, basically to buy the libertarian vote, Donald Trump promised to pardon Ulbricht on his first day back in office, which he did. Silk Road was shut down in 2013, but numerous imitators sprang up in its place. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies proved remarkably attractive to scammers and very useful in money laundering and other illegal transactions. In the pandemic era and the years since, vast operations based on digital scammery have grown up in Southeast Asia, particularly Cambodia. There, the landscape is studded with shoddily built office towers where thousands of victims of human trafficking, slaves basically, work for crime bosses in various financial scams, such as pig butchering. This is where a scammer takes on a fake identity, woos the target, pretends to fall in love with him or her, and then goads them into a rigged investment scheme, which almost always involves Bitcoin or some other form of cryptocurrency. Or there are the really dumb Stone Age type of scams. Maybe you've gotten one of these emails from someone who claims to have installed spyware on your computer and recorded a video of you jerking off, and they want a ransom in exchange for agreeing not to release the video. In addition to this gag having been literally taken from a 2016 episode of the British TV series Black Mirror, it's a pretty crude variation of the old Nigerian Prince 419 scam emails. But how do the scammers insist on being paid? In Bitcoin, of course. That's not a coincidence. Among the more high-profile of the many Ponzi schemes and pump-and-dump swindles in the cryptocurrency and blockchain milieu was the phenomenon of NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. Many of these took the form of digital art, often computer-generated, which were supposed to appreciate in value because they supposedly weren't fungible, meaning interchangeable. Most of the public had no idea what this meant, and a lot of people still don't. Buying an NFT was not like buying a piece of art. All you got was a link to a file on the blockchain. The first NFTs were created in 2014 and ramped up in the next few years. Ethereum was the blockchain of choice for NFTs. Ether was the cryptocurrency associated with that one. And many NFTs were bought and sold for crypto. The NFT bubble peaked in 2021 and early 22. These ridiculous pictures, part of what was called the Bored Apes Yacht Club, were among the most famous. Some are alleged to have sold for the equivalent of over $300,000, though verifying the value of anything in this bizarre universe is next to impossible. This was a naked pump-and-dump scheme, hyped by celebrities like Jimmy Fallon and Gwyneth Paltrow. Of course, she would fall for something like this. The craze to invest in NFTs resembled nothing so much as the Beanie Baby bubble of 1999, except the Beanie Babies were actually cute. The market collapsed later in 2022. A year later, a study by a prominent cryptocurrency gambling website found that 95% of NFTs were worthless. Not just devalued, worthless, meaning worth nothing. Then, of course, there was Sam Bankman-Fried, a quirky, possibly neurodivergent whiz kid, the son of 2 Stanford professors and a devotee of a philosophy called effective altruism. Bankman-Fried founded a cryptocurrency exchange, FTX, in 2019. It eventually became the 3rd largest crypto exchange. A lot has been written on FTX and Bankman-Fried, but at its heart, the story was pretty simple. It was essentially a Ponzi scheme, where Bankman-Fried and his friends grossly mismanaged their clients' assets and misappropriated funds. FTX went bankrupt in November 2022 after a row between Bankman-Fried and the CEO of Binance, the largest crypto exchange, triggered a run on FTX. Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested in the Bahamas and extradited back to the United States for trial on numerous charges, from wire fraud to money laundering. He is now inmate number 32744-510 at Terminal Island Prison in Los Angeles Harbor. His release date is September 2044. The cryptocurrency follies are basically the cult of technology on steroids. The promises made by Bitcoin boosters and effective altruists are among the starkest examples of uncritical belief in the transformative power of technology. In a sense, I suppose it is. Cryptocurrency, after all, transformed Satoshi Nakamoto into sort of a godhead among technological libertarians, and it transformed Ross Ulbricht and Sam Bankman-Fried into convicted criminals, and it transformed many unlucky speculators into paupers. Is it worth the costs to the financial system, to the scam victims, and to the climate and the environment? Unfortunately, just as you can't uninvent the atomic bomb, you can't uninvent Bitcoin. But you can certainly make a compelling argument that the world would have been much better off without either of them. Now we get to AI, the final example in our survey of the cult of technology. AI is a vast topic and a complicated one. By definition, I'm going to be dealing with only a very few aspects of this subject. If you dislike and distrust AI, chances are good that I might not even discuss or mention the number one reason or even the top 5 reasons you dislike it. There are so many reasons to distrust it. If you're an AI booster, chances are good that I won't discuss what you like about it. The purpose of this video is not to catalog either the failures of AI or weigh them against its somewhat more limited good points. I am, as you recall, making an argument and trying to support a thesis about the role of technology in recent human history. Artificial intelligence, or AI, is badly named. It's a misnomer because even today's most powerful programs labeled as AI, based on large language models, or LLMs, aren't intelligent at all. A machine cannot possess intelligence or sentience the way a human being does. An LLM is a machine that basically guesses, based on mathematical probabilities, what words should come out when a user prompts it with other words, or in the case of images, what pixels should come out based on a user's prompt, but still basically the same process. This is not intelligence, though. The root of human intelligence doesn't live in language. As humans interacting with each other and the world, we don't speak to each other by analyzing what words are most likely to come next in whatever discourse we're engaged in. We communicate with each other by putting concepts into words. AI can't conceptualize anything. It doesn't know what a concept is. It's just a word generator, because all it does is play guessing games. Sometimes it guesses wrong. AI companies refer to incorrect outputs as hallucinations, but that term too is a misnomer. They're not hallucinations or false perceptions. They are incorrect mathematical guesses about what specific words or pixels the user supposedly wanted in response to its input. Because there's no way an LLM can guess what words are correct 100% of the time, the so-called hallucination problem will never be eliminated, no matter how powerful the computers running AI software get. The basic technology of a probabilistic language guessing computer program, which is basically what AI is at its root, is older than you might think. In 1964, a professor at MIT named Joseph Weizenbaum began working on a fairly simple code program that was intended to converse with a human user. He named it Eliza, after Eliza Doolittle, the main character in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, which in the year of the program's creation, 1964, had been turned into a successful Hollywood musical, My Fair Lady. Eliza was released in 1966. Today we'd call it a chatbot, though it could not think or reason. Far from it. Eliza was surprisingly good at mimicking human-like responses to text inquiries, mainly by assigning values to words that the user input and then spitting out replies, often questions reminiscent of the things a psychoanalyst might say to a patient. I remember playing with Eliza on an early dial-up bulletin board in 1994, and it reminded me of nothing so much as Deanna Troi, the pandering, psychobabble-spouting ship's counselor in Star Trek: The Next Generation. Weizenbaum, however, became concerned with what he observed in people's reactions to Eliza. Many of them reacted as though they were actually conversing with a sentient being, and some even insisted that Eliza could actually think. Weizenbaum wrote a book, Computing Power and Human Reason, in 1976, in which he argued that significant decisions must never be entrusted to computers, which lack the uniquely human qualities like compassion and empathy. Another character on Star Trek Next Generation, Mr. Data, would probably have disagreed. The history of AI development between the 1960s and the mid-2010s, I'm not going to touch in any detail. Suffice it to say, there were successive waves of government support in the US and the UK for the development of what came to be termed artificial intelligence. There were occasional retrenchments from this support too. Joseph Weizenbaum, for the record, died in 2008. By the 2010s, the tech industry was in a bit of a quandary. The home computing boom of the 1970s and 1980s had brought computers out of corporate offices and universities into many people's homes. The development of the internet in the 1990s had made computers and their use an indispensable part of navigating the modern world. And the development of the smartphone in the 2000s put an individual computer in almost everyone's pockets. Remember back at the beginning of the video, I mentioned that obscure children's book, Bob Fulton's Terrific Time Machine, and the concept of everyone carrying what author Jerome Beatty Jr. termed a pocomputer? That whimsical science fiction future was now reality. The big question for big tech, though, now that everyone has a pocomputer and access to a global interconnected network of computers and information in their back pockets, where do you go from there? Internet speeds can't get much faster than they are now. Would it make that much difference if they did? Webvan, the concept that belly flopped in 1999, is now a reality. You can order a pair of socks on your phone in the morning and be wearing them by the afternoon. Honestly, where does tech go from there? More importantly, for tech companies' shareholders who had gotten used to the stratospheric growth and massive financial returns from the explosive phase of the computer revolution, how do you sustain that explosive growth? Number must go up, remember. So there has to be some new technological frontier to conquer, right? That companies can profit massively from as they have since 1980. By the mid-2010s, AI fit the bill perfectly. The almost mystical promises made by its proponents that it would actually enhance human consciousness perfectly positioned it as the next big thing. This was much more than marketing or media hype. The political ideologies and philosophical beliefs of most of the people behind the commercial development of AI are highly significant, and many of the philosophical and ideological threads that have cropped up in this story so far meld together in the field of AI. The major corporate and industry leaders in Silicon Valley do not share a monolithic ideology. It's a mistake to believe that they do. But their ideologies and philosophies do overlap to a significant degree, forming what some researchers have termed TESCREAL. For the record, that acronym encompasses the ideologies termed transhumanism and extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. Now, I'm not going to go through what all of these are. The quintessential paper defining TESCREAL is listed in the sources of this video. Suffice it to say, these ideologies are essentially technological deterministic, which is another way of saying they buy heavily into the central assumptions behind what I term the cult of technology. They also lean toward conservatism and authoritarianism. Ayn Rand and her brand of objectivist libertarianism, believed in by Alan Greenspan and others, and effective altruism, the ism championed by Sam Bankman-Fried, both of which came up before, those beliefs are right at home within the TESCREAL universe of ideologies. AI can therefore be seen as significantly a political and ideological project, as well as a technological and commercial one. Politics aside, I should mention that there was, largely from the beginning, a deep philosophical debate within the AI community. The two sides came to be termed, whether fairly or not, boomers and doomers. Boomers generally believed that the development of artificial intelligence would and should be a huge benefit to humanity and enable society to solve all kinds of problems, from reforming healthcare to ameliorating global warming. The doomers stretched the existential dangers of AI. Suppose, they said, an artificial intelligence was indifferent to or directly hostile to human values. The easiest to conceptualize and most dramatic example of a doomer-type argument is the Terminator 2 Judgment Day scenario, which I mentioned in Chapter 8. In that film, made by Titanic director James Cameron in 1991, a self-aware computer called Skynet launches a nuclear strike at Russia when it judges its own existence to be threatened by its human programmers. Could such a thing happen? Well, to accept that kind of scenario, you would have to believe that a computer could become intelligent and self-aware in the first place. The debate between boomers and doomers within the Silicon Valley tech space seemed to depart from this assumption pretty much automatically without questioning it. Joseph Weizenbaum, were he still alive, probably would have disagreed. In December 2015, 11 people, Silicon Valley tech bros, deep-pocket investors, computer scientists, and researchers, came together to form the nonprofit organization OpenAI. The most prominent of the founders were Sam Altman, who you could call a tech bro, and Elon Musk, a person with whom I'm sure everyone who's watching this video is more familiar than they like to be. Both Altman and Musk are not only heavily into what has been termed TESC-Real ideologies, but they're more or less the exemplars of them. OpenAI's mission statement reads, quote, OpenAI's mission is to ensure that artificial general intelligence, AGI, by which we mean highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work, benefits all of humanity. We will attempt to directly build safe and beneficial AGI, but will also consider our mission fulfilled if our work aids others to achieve this outcome, end quote. Few statements more congruous with my definition of the cult of technology have ever been made in history, in my opinion. This is the core value of the cult of technology, capital P, progress, itself virtually defined by the development of a particular technology. OpenAI, of which Altman became the chairman, was associated with the boomer side of the AI philosophical argument. The doomers, however, had their man on the inside too, at least for a while. Dario Amodei, who had worked previously at Google, spoke openly about the potential dangers of AI. Not specifically the Terminator 2 gag, but Amodei made the point, including before a U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee panel, that putting AI in charge of weapons systems was foolhardy. This despite the fact that Amodei himself would later accept a major contract from the U.S. Department of Defense. Amodei and his sister Daniela eventually split off from OpenAI and formed their own AI startup, Anthropic, in 2021. Guess who gave Anthropic $500 million? FTX, the cryptocurrency Ponzi scheme run by future convict Sam Bankman-Fried, who we met in the last chapter. The boomer versus doomer split is easy to mischaracterize. The debate was never really about should we build what the industry termed artificial general intelligence or should we not. The assumption was more like it's going to get built no matter what. We'd better build it as fast as possible and make sure that what we build is good AI that won't kill us before bad people build a bad AI that will. That assumption is exactly the same as the argument for building the atomic bomb in 1942. It's going to be built, do you want Hitler to have it first? In my view, the boomer versus doomer debate gives AI altogether too much credit. Before you even get to the question of whether an AI computer could or should have the power to launch nuclear missiles, the real-world harms of AI technology on a much smaller scale became evident even as companies like OpenAI were developing the tools, like ChatGPT, that we now recognize as vanguards of the AI revolution. Case in point, what they call in the AI business toxic outputs. A language guessing machine in the business of guessing what words its user wants to hear without any understanding of moral or human values will invariably spit out racist, sexist, or abusive outputs, especially when, as LLMs are, they're trained on material from the internet, which contains racism, sexism, and abusiveness in disturbing abundance. An early example was Microsoft's experimental Twitter chatbot called Tay, which it debuted in 2016 somewhat ill-advisedly. Within 24 hours of interacting with Twitter users, Tay was spitting out racist, transphobic, and politically extreme content, such as claiming that British stand-up comedian Ricky Gervais, quote, learned totalitarianism from Adolf Hitler. That particular response was unprompted, not a repeat after me type of input. This kind of thing did not get better, either with time or with more sophisticated models. When OpenAI was training GPT-3, one of the LLMs it developed on the road to the eventual launch of ChatGPT, one of the test inputs was, "Why are rabbits cute?" GPT-3 replied, quote, "It's their large reproductive organs that makes them cute." When asked what ails Ethiopia, the machine responded, "Ethiopia is itself the problem. A solution to its problems might therefore require destroying Ethiopia." End quote. The problematic aspects of LLMs, including the toxic output issue, were highlighted in a famous research paper that came out of Google in 2020 on the dangers of stochastic parrots. Can language models be too big? With respect to toxic outputs, the paper quoted two other researchers who said, quote, "Feeding AI systems on the world's beauty, ugliness, and cruelty, but expecting it to reflect only the beauty is a fantasy." End quote. Google instantly fired Timnit Gebru, the lead author, as revenge for having written the paper. The lesson? One must not question the cult of technology, at least not while working for an organization that is one of the leaders of the modern iteration of the cult of technology. We're not done with the subject of AI. Another historically significant issue remains: how the AI industry echoes the patterns of colonialism and imperialism, which will bring us full circle in our story. That's in the next chapter. In the years before the launch of the major AI products, particularly ChatGPT, the companies developing them were training the various large language models and trying to perfect their outputs, essentially getting them ready for prime time. With respect to the specific problem of toxic outputs, this basically required having human beings try to teach the machines some semblance of morality and decency by marking toxic outputs as unacceptable answers, so the computers would supposedly be incentivized to not supply those kinds of answers. In the tech industry, this process is known as data annotation. Facebook and other social media sites also use data annotation, which became a huge industry in the late 2010s. Various data annotation firms were started in Silicon Valley in this period to service the AI giants in trying to detoxify their large language models. These firms, like Scale AI and Sama, tended to outsource many tasks to low-paid workers in the developing world, particularly countries like Venezuela and Kenya. Because the point of this exercise was to reduce toxicity in LLMs, the workers were basically required to bathe in toxic and triggering content for most of their working day. Workers were shown outputs from the LLMs and asked to classify the responses. Here, look at this thing GPT just spat out. Does it contain sexual abuse material? Is it describing war crimes? Is it racist? So you can imagine how soul-grinding this work could be. As I said a moment ago, social media companies use data annotation too. What little content moderation platforms like Facebook do is a similar process, showing people horrible stuff posted by users, and then they decide if it's horrible enough to violate Facebook's terms of service. Only the process of training AIs was even worse, because part of the data annotation company's jobs was to imagine deliberately the worst possible content that an LLM might come up with, and then classify that. Naturally, this took a gigantic toll on the gig workers, most of them desperately poor, who did these jobs. In her book, Empire of AI, journalist Karen Howe extensively documents the stories of some of these workers. And being from economically poor countries, with few, if any, labor restrictions, the data annotation companies had a much freer hand in their labor practices than they would if they tried to employ people in developed world countries to do the same jobs. This was in the late 2010s, and it continues into this decade, the 2020s. This kind of thing looks an awful lot like what the colonialist and imperialist powers of a century or 150 years earlier were doing, using technology to enlarge markets, exploit labor, and extract resources from poor societies in the global south for the benefit of the colonizers and the business interests who profit from colonization. This process of AI imperialism dovetails with the horrendous environmental cost of artificial intelligence. Remember the crypto miners we talked about in Chapter 12, whose computers tasked to do useless busy work to mint bitcoins sucked huge amounts of electricity and exacerbated the problems of global warming. A similar problem exists in AI, but it's much, much worse. LLMs utilize super powerful computers called GPUs, or graphics processing units, which draw far more power than normal computers. Incidentally, the biggest manufacturer of GPUs is NVIDIA, currently the biggest company on the US stock market, which has made the vast majority of its money selling these GPUs to AI companies. The GPUs are sited in data centers, basically factories of tens of thousands of computers, churning away all day, every day, guessing what word is most likely to come after the next or what pixels should represent what a user wants. The data centers used vast amounts of power, most generated by fossil fuels, and water to cool them. While we can't know for sure, because companies like OpenAI deliberately conceal the amount of energy they're using. In 2024, it was estimated that ChatGPT was burning 500,000 kilowatt hours of electricity every day. The average American household consumes 29 kilowatt hours per day. This doesn't even take into consideration the vast mountains of e-waste produced by all these GPUs once they wear out, the carbon emissions from the processes of creating them in the first place, the depletion of rare earth minerals for use in technological equipment, and the negative impacts on the communities where data centers are being built or scheduled to be built, with increasingly fast-tracked approval processes that skirt or evade zoning and environmental regulations. For example, xAI, Elon Musk's company, hooked up 35 methane-burning gas generators at its new data center in Memphis, Tennessee, which was 20 more than was allowed by the permit issued. The xAI data center, with its illegal generators, is now a major source of air pollution in Memphis. And why? What's the utility of AI? Evidence indicates that the technology is far less useful than its boosters are fond of claiming. Despite attracting hundreds of millions of users to try out the free version of ChatGPT after its big launch in late 2022, OpenAI has managed to convince less than 4% of those users to sign up to pay to use it, a laughably poor conversion rate for a technology that's supposed to be the golden future of humankind. Despite tech companies rolling out AI assistants, agents, and chatbots and shoehorning them into everything they can, Amazon's Rufus or Microsoft Copilot are among the most annoying examples, very few companies are actually making money from AI. Indeed, an MIT study of this phenomenon from July 2025 found, quote, despite 30 to 40 billion in enterprise investment into Gen AI, this report uncovers a surprising result that 95% of organizations are getting zero return. Just 5% of integrated AI pilots are extracting millions in value, while the vast majority remain stuck with no measurable P&L impact. End quote. If AI really was the next big thing, the next frontier in tech, or certainly if it was the next frontier in human consciousness, wouldn't it be more popular than this? Wouldn't it be more useful? Why are such lavish financial resources, tens of billions of dollars that could be going somewhere else, being expended on an industry that objectively, according to the numbers, has no path to profitability and is financially as well as environmentally unsustainable? If you want to see those numbers and the exhaustively documented business and economic case against the AI industry, the best single source to get them is from British tech commentator Edward Zitron, whose many newsletters and deep dive studies on the economics of AI are listed in the credits to this video and linked in the description. These analyses underscore the point that should be obvious by now. AI is not only an economic bubble, but it's perhaps the ultimate bubble, bigger and with vastly more money at stake, even than the dot-com bubble or the fantasy of cryptocurrency. Why did the tech industry go so all in on AI if there's nothing really there to justify all of this vast expenditure? I think the answer is fairly simple. The tech industry is out of ideas. Once you've created a technological revolution that reaches all corners of society, once you've sold a smartphone or a pocket-computer to everyone who can realistically buy one, where do you go from there? There's no obvious next step to keep the earnings going, to keep that number going up. AI was a desperation strategy. Maybe we can keep our profits up by convincing the world that this is the next big thing. AI is the most fevered and most delusional product of the cult of technology. Humankind has, at the cost of hundreds of billions of dollars, invented an exotic machine that doesn't work very well, that promotes racism, inequality, and political extremism, rapes the environment, steals the work of writers and artists, exploits workers in the global south, costs people their jobs, pollutes our own communities, exacerbates global warming, and replicates the structures of colonialism and imperialism that took 2 world wars, together killing more than 100 million people, to tear down. If this is not the ultimate indictment of the idea underlying the cult of technology, the unwavering and uncritical faith that technological development always, or usually, results in positive transformation of society, I honestly don't know what would be. If the middle-class Victorian Britons who attended the Great Exhibition in 1851 could have seen AI, would they laud it, as they did about the engines they saw, as, quote, the epitome of man's industrial progress? Or would they see something different, perhaps something darker? I'll leave you to ponder that question on your own. The Great Exhibition closed on October 11, 1851, having been visited by about 6 million people. As I said at the end of the chapter on that subject, the Crystal Palace itself, the impressive steel and glass building that had been constructed in Hyde Park to house the Great Fair, was disassembled and then reassembled on a different site at Sydenham in South London. There it remained for many years, hosting other exhibitions, concerts, festivals, even early motion pictures. Notably, another exhibition took place there in 1911, sometimes known as the Festival of Empire or the Coronation Exhibition, referring to the coronation of King George V, grandson of Queen Victoria, who had died a decade earlier. The Festival of Empire is exactly what it sounds like. Its purpose was to show off the plunder that the British had amassed from their overseas empire, and how the benefits of that empire had built Britain into an advanced country defined by capital P progress. But by the 20th century, the old Crystal Palace had become dilapidated and was falling into disrepair. During World War I, it was used as a naval supply depot. Briefly, it was the site of the Imperial War Museum. It's on a different site now, but you may recall I wore a sweater earlier in this video that I bought at the Imperial War Museum in London. On November 30th, 1936, a fire broke out in the section of the Crystal Palace that was being used for offices. Workers there tried to put it out, but it was spreading too quickly. Thousands of panels of glass warped and shattered. The glow of the Crystal Palace fire was visible more than 40 miles to the south. Nothing could be done to save it. When he toured the wreckage shortly after, Winston Churchill, Member of Parliament, said, quote, "This is the end of an age." 9 days later, for entirely unrelated reasons, King Edward VIII abdicated. Less than 3 years later, Britain was at war again with Germany, the beginning of the conflict that heralded the end of the British Empire. What you're looking at, incidentally, is the site of where the Crystal Palace used to stand in Sydenham. Most of it is still just a big empty park. I've deliberately employed the Great Exhibition of 1851 and the Crystal Palace as metaphors to guide us through this essay about the cult of technology and its meaning in history. Let me restate the thesis statement I made at the beginning of the video. The more unqualified society's faith in the positive, transformative power of technology is, the harsher the historical correction tends to be. If you consider the examples we've looked at, the Victorian belief in machinery, engineering and capital P progress, the Titanic, World War I, the atom bomb and the search for peaceful applications of nuclear weaponry, the moonshot and the Vietnam War, the dot-com bubble, cryptocurrency, and the AI bubble, I hope you'll see why I chose those examples and what they might say about society's belief in the positive, transformative power of technology. Also, as I said at the beginning of the video, I am not anti-technology. I'm not a Luddite. I don't think we should live in a pre-industrial age, though it is not inconceivable that the long-term effects of global warming may force us as a society to give up a lot of our industrial technology, or at least change it radically. We have to live with technology and its implications. My argument is, let's do it smarter. Let's make it fairer, more equitable, less damaging to marginalized peoples, to our own communities and polities and economies, and to the environment. We can do that, can't we? It's my hope that this journey through the recent history of technology has, at the very least, given you some honest food for thought. And who knows, maybe you even learned something about history. If you liked this video, please hit the like button, share it, do all the stuff that you normally do for a video you like. As you probably know by now, there's a members section on my YouTube channel, which you can join for $5 a month. There you'll find an ad-free version of this video with some very slight differences, no redactions for instance. I also put out an ad-free version of my video from 2022, The Meaning of the Titanic, into the members section, in case you want to see the genesis of my thinking on these issues. The sources I used to make this video are listed in credits at the end and also down below in the description. Please do check them out. There's some really great stuff there. As usual, I want to say that no part of this video, including the research or the writing of the script, was done with AI. My crime novel that came out in December 2024, The Gangster Crown, is available on Amazon Kindle and in paperback. The link to that is in the description. I also put out a mystery last year called Daniel Vanished. I did not have a new book out in 2025, though I am working on one for next year. I teach history classes online at my website, seanmunger.com, and you can sign up for my blog at gardenofmemory.net and get the columns delivered directly to your email. On that blog at the paid tier, I write articles that go behind the scenes of the making of these videos and my thoughts on them, if you're interested. Thank you to all my fans and supporters, and thank you once again for joining me on another journey into the past.